All right, so tonight we've got Bruce Fenton with us. He's been researching ancient mysteries in human consciousness, two of our favorite topics here, of course. And he's written an ebook series, a Revolutionary Human Origins series. The first book, The Forgotten Exodus, and that's about the into Africa theory of human evolution. I've read it. It's pretty fascinating. He's also a current member of the Paleoanthropology Society and the Scientific and Medical Network. And he's into all kinds of good stuff here. We're happy to have you on the show. Thanks for coming, Bruce.
Thank you very much for having me on. Looking forward to talking about, all these weird and wonderful topics.
Yeah, it's like you mentioned in your email, and I've finished your book, and it was pretty deep, pretty heavy. Tough for me to wrap my head around, but it's a topic that's always interested me, like this, where we came from, right? The human origins, and how you seem to be right on top of all the latest research, like to even like 2016.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the book literally does deal with all the cutting edge, finds and the latest genetic research projects that have gone on. It's all in there. In fact, really, I would just say that it's only in the last couple of years that the evidence has got to a tipping point where I'd say, it has destroyed the old paradigm.
Right. And let's just summarize that for people, because so the old paradigm, as far as like this topic goes, is that that humans came out of Africa. How long ago would that be? Like, can you summarize sort of the mainstream paradigm for us, and then we'll get into like what you've found.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so essentially the idea is, the main, idea is anyway, that around 5 million years ago, somewhere in Eastern Africa, the first of our line was born from an ancestral primate. That this single primate, had a daughter that would be the great grandmother of all humans, and another daughter that would be the great grandmother of all, modern chimpanzees. And essentially, that's where where and when that split is meant to have happened. Within about a couple of million years, we would then saw the first of what we might call hominins, or more human-like primates that could use tools. That was one of the significant developments, supposedly in that timeline. And then at last, we appear around about 200,000 years ago or so. Right. There was these archaic, what they call archaic Homo sapiens, or Homo sapiens idaltu, and they appear again in East Africa. And then there is two significant migrations that the theory gives. Around 130,000 years ago, humans walked out of Africa into the Levant region and the edges of the Middle East, but this first migration essentially failed, and that they died off within that region. And then there is a second migration out of Africa, which occurs around about 70,000 years ago. And this is the migration which is said to have, colonized the planet. And I should just give briefly on the roots of that. So when they went out, they go out through the Levant, through the Middle East, down through Asia, down into Southeast Asia, and on to Australia by 50,000 years ago. There's an entry into Australia. Europe is colonized later, around about sort of 35,000 years ago. And then the Americas last, up until recently, it was said about 13,000 years ago. And that was that final wave of colonization.
That doesn't leave a lot of time to change color.
That's my point, kind of.
That's because you're a racist.
Well, there's all sorts of anomalies in there, which we can get to as well. I mean, one thing I should add as well is that there's another migration, which is important, although it's not of our ancestors, is that, there's this Homo erectus migration out of Africa, supposedly, at around about 2 million years ago. And these are the ancestors of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other hominins that are related to us. So they supposedly come from this separate, earlier migration.
Okay, interesting. So lots of little holes, lots of gaps in there, and there really wasn't a lot of hardcore research that propelled that theory, right? It was kind of scant. It's just one of those things that takes hold as these things do over time.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of this area of research, I mean, up until a few decades ago, there was still, a majority leaning towards out of Asia theories. That only started to crumble after the discoveries by Leakey in Africa back in the 60s. But really, finally, the out of Asia theory collapsed in the early 90s when two very respected scientists, Kahn and Wilson, they produced papers on this idea that there was an origin only in Africa, and this single African Eve theory that we can all trace our line back to this woman in Africa around 200,000 years ago, and that she is the mother of all humans, and that therefore there is this migration later which populates the world. So we're only talking about the early 90s that this became the completely the widely held consensus across the planet. Right. So these paradigms do change. They come and go. As the evidence changes, and there was always holes in that theory. It certainly wasn't perfect, but I would say it was the best of the evidence available, to everybody, and that there is always a limitation of how many fossil finds were available, etc. So to a degree, people were doing the best with what they had.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Why do you think the dogma sets in?
Well, there's always money, isn't there? Because once you are being funded for a particular project, or you've released certain textbooks and books, or you're giving certain courses, really you have to look at it. There's not a great benefit to most of the academics for this paradigm to shift. If anything, there is problems. There's confusion, there's problems, there's loss of respectability and credentials. I think that is one of the major issues you have whenever a paradigm is under threat, not just in this area, but as in consciousness research and stuff, we all have interested in, that the same happens there, that the materialists who really have at the moment got domination of the field, are not keen to hand that over to the outside thinkers who are saying, hang on a minute, that doesn't make sense. And I think that's a problem you have everywhere, that those that are, I'd say climate change is probably one of the big ones for that, isn't it? There's a lot of budgets. There's a lot of budgets that, we're getting a lot of money, out of these ideas sometimes. So people don't really want to sort of look at any evidence that undermines their position or their name, their respectable name in the community. And I think that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, I'd agree. We're stuck with that.
I wonder when that shifted, when people got up on their high horse and were like, just ruined everything.
Yeah, and you can imagine, do you think that a leading paleoanthropologist, with multiple degrees, wants to hear that an independent researcher has blown his theory out of the water?
Yeah.
No, but maybe he could have blown his own theory out of the water if he would have just not put his feet.
Well, that's
out.
Right. Yeah, and they've got the access to the same information that I have, of course, and ahead of me. So, in a way, it's surprising that none of them have sort of, pointed at the emperor and said he's got no clothes on, because they could do it and, get the glory, whereas, I'm most likely to be ignored. So it is surprising that we haven't found at least one of these academics that would have stood up and said this. But I have noticed they're creeping towards some of these conclusions that I've offered. If you look at some of the presentations, you'll see that they're starting to say, this doesn't really fit. We're not sure what's happening here, and it's starting to sound a lot more uncertain.
I feel like this is a little easier to make that happen than, let's say, consciousness or climate change, because it seems like you've got a little bit more easy access to physical data and some pretty hard dates and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, it's not so much based on models, computer models and simulations. Yeah, so there is that advantage in archaeology and anthropology that we can look at physical evidence and we can take genes and and analyze them. So yeah, that's right. It should be easier to change this paradigm than the others.
So let's get into some of that then. I guess the main summary of your book and your paradigm shifting sort of hypothesis here.
Okay, yeah, I'll give you a bit of where I differ from the mainstream. Essentially, the evidence that is available would tend to say that yes, that an awful lot of the stages of human development and certainly a concentration of ancient humans, what we call hominins, were in Africa. And so in the book, I do start off with an analysis of Africa and talk about some of these, I guess the oldest examples of our line. But I do want to throw in something here, and that's that, originally the first primates that we know of, our earliest ancestors, if you like, were down in Asia, down in Southeast Asia, and up until around 30 million years ago or so. And they made this exodus to Africa. I think that's important just to keep in mind that, this is not fully an African story anyway. It really is also a Southeast Asian story. And that some of those primates remained there. I mean, of course, we see like the orangutan, is still down in Southeast Asia. And there is a question mark in my mind as to whether or not perhaps some of these primates ancestral to us may have also remained in Asia. And I don't discuss that in the book simply because there is not enough evidence as yet, but that evidence may well manifest. We might find that the earliest part of this human story is also a non-African story. But for now, anyway, I've stuck with the yes, that, it seems that several million years ago, the first hominins appear in Africa. Where I differ is that, for a start, I point out that rather than the first tool use being around 2.5 million years ago, that in fact we now know that there were hominins using tools in Africa 3.3 million years ago, for a start. So, I should clarify here that, any tool using hominin should be considered Homo, i.e. one of our genus. And that's because that was the original criteria for an early human. So if we see tool use, we have to say, hang on a minute, these must be Homo as well. So the idea that we've arose about 2.5 million years ago is the first thing that kind of gets dealt with in my book, that we're wrong. That Homo were around much earlier, possibly earlier than that, and that prior to what they call Australopithecus, I believe that the other examples that they tackle in Africa are basically primates. So I think Australopithecus, for me, are the first of the true Homo species. And you'll note in the book, I actually rename Australopithecus as Homo Australopithecus for that reason, which is something I think that needs to be done in the academic halls as well. They have to recognize that, hang on a minute, this being is also using tools.
Yeah. Therefore, it's Lucy was?
Yeah, Lucy, I believe, was an early Australopithecus, yes. But prior to that, there are a couple of other, possible ancestors that they do point to in Africa. I tackle those in the book, and I say that, my opinion is that they are not really ancestors. I mean, one of them is Sahelanthropus chadinus. I might not pronounce these well, but my Latin's rusty. Orarin tugenensis. And that these are sort of pre-human forms, which they say may be ancestral. But in all honesty, they are pretty indistinguishable from apes. So I'm of the opinion that we should consider them ancestors of apes.
So is this Australopithecus?
Australopithecus?
Is it like halfway between a primate and us? Because it is in a timeline. Like if they say that we sort of separated out about 5 million years ago, and this is like 3.3 million now. Did we, like, I don't want to just jump in evolution here as well, but I've been reading these other books from Stephen Meyer, like Signature in the Cell, and stuff that tries to argue against, us evolving from one species to the next, right? That it's more of, there's, the mystery of the Cambrian explosion and some other evidence that shows that we didn't. But is this sort of evidence that we came from a common ancestor, or is it still just human, like too human?
Well, I think Australopithecus is relatively too human, I suppose. I mean, when you look at these others,
the other two that you mentioned,
they're definitely more.
Yeah,
they're definitely more chimpanzee-like. But I mean, we're still talking about pretty small-brained, hominins. But then there's another argument there as well, as as to whether how important is the size of the brain, which is another argument. And as you guys probably know, they found people that have just, a thin layer of brain inside the skull, and they're, are performing perfectly well in their lives. And then we have, the blue whale and stuff that have enormous brains, and that they're not necessarily more intelligent in the way we judge intelligent than we are. So, this issue of the brain also is a bit, I think, it's a bit of it's a bit of a confusing one because we can easily say, okay, well, this one's got a bigger brain, but yet was it using that in an intelligent way? Or so, I mean, that's another issue. But I do think in terms of the form, the morphology, the evidence of bipedal movement, we're seeing that certainly in these Australopithecus, but not in these other examples.
Right.
But again, there's a question here, and I will bring this up because I think it's really worth exploring. Is that there's been this assumption for a very long time that that we all come from this quadrupedic, arboreal, like our ape, they're swinging through the trees and all the rest of it. They're around about 5 million years ago. We start to adapt from that more to a bipedal ground dweller, but that's not proven. That's something that we've been taught it throughout our lives, so we've accepted it. But there's a number of of anthropologists that are sort of challenging that, saying, well, there's not really any more evidence for that than to say that we came from a bipedal human-like creature, which then gave birth to these two lines, the chimpanzee line and our line. That there's no real evidence to say. And in fact, if you look at the way like chimpanzees and gorillas and stuff move, the knuckle walking, it's very unlike other quadrupedic beings, and it looks more like a bipedal animal that has regressed to quadrupedal walking. When you look at them, they don't walk in the way that cows and sheep and other quadrupeds walk. It's quite a peculiar movement. And that when you really think, well, hang on a minute, there's no particular reason why we can't be from a bipedal human-like ancestor.
Did you find any evidence of any sort of aquatic ancestry when you were doing your research?
No, but I mean, I can see the argument that we've spent time in marshy areas, and this idea that we're sort of streamlined for water, and that we've lost our hair, and I've listened to some of the debates on that, but again, I appreciate the dangers of us being in water. That crocodiles and stuff were always around, that it wouldn't have been necessarily safer to be in a water area than it would be for us to be in the savannas. And I'm sure that we spent some time foraging in swamps and whatnot, but there's some pretty big crocodiles back then, didn't they? These enormous crocodiles that could just swallow you. So I mean, I guess there'd be a natural fear of being in that water for any long period of time. I'd be surprised if we'd chosen to live in that water for a period, because we're not very well suited to being in deep water. So no, I don't see that's a very convincing argument that we've spent considerable periods largely in water. I think if anything, we would have foraged in swamps. Yeah, I've seen the
I like to picture it more like swimming on the beach. Diving.
Yeah, I mean, we may have spent some time, but again, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm not keen even now with all the sharks, and especially I'm in Australia.
I don't go in the ocean.
Swimming in the beach, anywhere you are in Australia is pretty dangerous. I mean, certainly the north coast, they've got saltwater crocs, deadly jellyfish, sea snakes, just this long line of deadly animals. It's like, I think I'll just sit on the beach.
Yeah, if I lived in Australia, I don't think I'd leave my house.
So, I mean, I'm not sure about the aquatic ape theory. I guess that, it may have had some small part to play, but I think, that we've been shaped more for, being on land. The fact that we are bipedal tends to have more benefit, I think, in the savannas and, seeing the prey that's ahead of you, rather if it's under the water, or, if your enemies are under the water, it doesn't necessarily give you a great advantage.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think so my Wolfen theory is no good.
Darren's got this. We've been arguing about this theory that wolves and dolphins have the same hips or something like that. So he thinks that that's some sort of proof.
I don't know what the animal would have looked like that became, that gave rise to the dolphin. I mean, obviously, supposedly, it was a land-dwelling creature and it returned to the sea. But I don't know what it looked like. I can't imagine they look very wolf-like, but I don't know. Who knows? I really don't know what they think that pre-dolphin creature looked like, and whether it shares some ancestry.
So that's where they get it from. See, I didn't get that they went from the land to the water.
Yeah, like when I say that a dolphin still has hip bones, I'm not joking around. They're there, but they're just not connected to anything. They're just there.
Yeah, that's right. They've still got the finger bones and toe bones and so. Say the same as the whales. Both dolphins and whales have returned to the sea. That's the claim anyway.
So maybe we got like halfway back to the sea, and then fucking too many of us got eaten by crocodiles. And we're like, nope,
come back to land.
See,
the problem I have with all this evolution,
it's a strange one.
Yeah, because all this evolution, this from species to species and us changing species, like I don't think there's enough evidence for that.
It's not changing species, though. It's all just different paths.
Yeah, we're sort of different lineages, and in a way, that's something else that I do tackle a bit. That that
it's like a giant family
the meaning of
tree
species versus lineages.
Okay, let's talk about that. That's a good way to that'll help me here because I can't.
Yeah, I think because for example, we often say that there are many human species. This is a fundamental part of hominin research is that we have these many hominin species. But I say, look, if you are into breeding and you're having viable offspring, i.e., that your offspring can then breed again and give, then you are essentially the same species in terms of the popular meaning of the terms, the word species, which is to do with breeding. And as far as we can see, the different human, lines have always been able to interbreed, i.e. they are different lineages with different morphology rather than true different species. And we see that in other animals. I know that obviously the lion and tiger can have these ligra children. And I'm given to understand that I think it's that the males may be infertile, but the females can breed still.
There's definitely some breeding problems. I don't know.
Yeah, so certainly the breeding problem. I believe there are instances where certainly one sex, I don't know if it's the male or female, that can sometimes still breed. So there's an argument to say that they are the same species, but the lineages have separated so far that they've accrued so many mutations or adaptations to different environments that one of the things that they've picked up is a breeding problem. That they can't easily produce those young. So there's a point when lineages pick up so many changes that one of the things that goes is the compatibility of their genes. And so then we can start to say, well, they've become different species, even though clearly they're members of the same, family. We can see a tiger and a lion are obviously closely related. But they do accrue these issues. So in evolutionary theory, obviously you're referring to this, the larger problem we have in evolution, there's a lot of grey areas and a lot of holes in the theory because, of course, we don't often see one form giving rise to another species. It's not something that in the time that we've been recording scientific observations that we've said, we've seen a number of these things happen. When we've seen certain things that have happened, like there's what called Darwin's finches have grown larger beaks, or significant adaptations to their environment or to climatic shifts. When you say, it's got a much larger beak than it had a couple hundred years ago. Yeah. So we do see, significant changes in form, but we don't tend to see entire new species arise. And I would say there's other problems there because, if we look at something, I'll take an example, there's the tarantula that is preyed upon by a wasp. That's a strange relationship to build up in terms of when we figure out evolutionary advantages and stuff because, going for, specializing in laying your egg on a predator that can kill you potentially, is a really strange, thing to arise by natural selection. Because you'd think the stupid wasp that wants to lay its egg on a tarantula is the one that should die off, and that we should have these other wasps who lay it somewhere sensible, and that they win the day. So we have these really strange relationships that have built up, which don't necessarily fit what we'd think of as the best idea winning the day. And how does that relationship start? Because when does a wasp first think, I'm going to start laying my eggs on that predator? So we have
kind of stuff opens up so many different cans of worms. Because then you talk about instinct and how does that wasp even know how to do that? And that just gets crazy.
It does get crazy. And I think, again, that goes perhaps into the other subject area that you cover, with the consciousness research. Because, I think that there's something far more weird and wonderful going on in the background that's controlling all of us, if you like, animals, people, the lower levels below physical matter, the programs, if you like, rising from consciousness, you know, or as I think Hammerhoff said, more like the symphonies, the music of, rather than programs. But certainly that, you know, there's more to it, and some of these things just seem to emerge rather than evolve. You know, that these, I mean, that's another,
like Sheldrake's thing, like morphic resonance and all that. Like it seems to get into that
100th monkey.
Yeah, where something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I still think a lot of those evolution problems could iron out if we could be looking at shit for more than a couple of 100 years, you know.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we have got limited, you know, we've got a limited bank of information there in terms of, you know, the genetic research and stuff. You know, we're really in the early days of that. And again, I think because the materialists have kind of held us back in some areas that, you know, with this prejudging that everything has to be their way, that, you know, once we start opening our minds a bit to how these relationships form and how these changes happen. You know, again, I would say evolution itself, in my opinion, is being driven by consciousness. I don't think you can explain these shifts to new species, which I believe are real, but I don't believe that they can necessarily happen in the way that current science is telling us, that it's all about natural selection and adaptation, because those tend to just change the form of an individual, you know, of a type within a species, but they don't necessarily easily lead to a new species. I think that there's something about the way consciousness works, that it's choosing to make its vehicle, you know, change, that it's changing the vehicle in a profound way at some point. It decides, now I will change this form, you know, and I make that sound like it's a person talking, but I don't know, maybe it is as strange as an entity making that decision, or maybe it's a bit more abstract than that. But I do feel that that's something arising from the consciousness level, the quantum level. I don't believe that we can explain these profound changes of a species, that, you know, that we came from a mouse, essentially something like a mouse-like creature. You know, that's the argument, that, you know, humans have arisen from those first small mammals, you know, something akin to a field mouse. And like, look at us now. I mean, that's an enormous shift. And like, you know, if we kept mice, you know, for millions of years, we would always expect to see more mice being born, wouldn't we? I mean, logically,
that's a good point.
Yeah, we don't tend to see that the mouse, suddenly one of them's got, you know, different. It's got now it's got fingers instead of little paws, and you know, there's something profound happening. And they do have, you know, many generations of mice have lived since humans have started, you know, looking at mice in science. But we don't see that. Yeah, we don't see any example in that species that seems to become more like a new species. They all remain mice. So no matter what environment they're in, what country they're in, you know, we're not seeing that happen. So why is it that this one group of mouse-like creatures has gone through so many profound changes that it's ended up being human beings? I mean, I find that problematic. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it seems incredibly unlikely, and we haven't seen strong evidence for that happening. And again, that's where I would say that we have to look at things like morphic resonance, and we have to look at consciousness driving evolution, and we have to start looking outside the box if we want to make, you know, a meaningful suggestion to how this happens, rather than just saying that, well, the mouse went into a new environment and it changed, because the mice are always going into new environments and they're not changing.
Yeah.
Well, 65 million years is a long time.
It is a long time, you know. And again, like, I'm not saying I'm absolutely right, but I suspect that, yeah, we have to look beyond simply, you know, that a new environment requires adaptation. I think that that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, the other problem is I still haven't found anyone who could explain to me how Canada was all under a mile of ice 15,000 years ago.
Not even 15,000.
And now every fucking pond in Canada is full of fish.
Yeah, I've heard that argument. The Fortean argument, isn't it, that if you dig a pond and leave it, eventually fish appear.
I've explained this to you, Darren. It's birds getting fish stuff on their feet from other ponds and flying over, and
they sure work fast.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's just because life is a staple. It's just if the conditions are there, it just happens.
Yeah.
That's this sort of Fortean idea. So I have heard that the Russians used to build these ponds, and they just trust that the fish would appear in them. No, I don't know if that's true, of course.
They hacked them in.
Build it and they will come. I like that.
That's right. You just build it and they will come. But yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff out there. I mean, I don't know whether that's obviously is the case. Probably the fish dropping, or even maybe the rains of fish, of course, which do happen, as we know. But there's these mysterious rains of frogs and fish. So perhaps every now and again, one of those rains of fish will fall in your pond.
So let's get into your into a little bit more depth into your paradigm. Then.
Sure.
So what's more of the difference between the start of your timeline with I think that's kind of where we left off as far as like your research specifically to this book goes.
Yeah. So what happened was I was researching a site in Ecuador. Now it's been given the name the Lost City of Giants in some of the media, but I would just say basically it's a megalithic site in the Amazon, which can't be easily attributed to any known culture. And I became caught up in this in 2012. And this is really what has led to this, because the site, the clues that are attached to the site basically led me to investigate a group of people called the Lagoa Santa type people in Brazil. And these Lagoa Santa type people are essentially Australoid or appear to be related to Aboriginal Australians and Papuans and people from that region. And there's this mysterious history in America that suggests that there was a colonization event by this type of, human around about 60,000 years or so ago. Now, this itself undermines part of out of Africa, because there's not supposed to be anyone in America at that point, and certainly not Australian Aboriginals. So that's where I kind of came into this, was, to try to understand how that could be possible. And that led me basically to do a reanalysis right from the beginning. So I'm a bit OCD, I'm probably a bit autistic, and I like to start things from the beginning. So, rather than just someone else would have said, well, okay, let's look 60,000 years ago, what's going on, in terms of migrations and, what's going on in Australia and in South America. I'm like, no, I have to start millions of years ago from the beginning and kind of logically follow this through because of my OCD, which is kind of good, because obviously that's led me to a number of other sort of discoveries which undermine the theory as well. And so I went all the way back, found out that yes, in fact that we could be, related to a primitive human-like being was the first one. Then of course that these Australopithecus were Homo was the next revelation that came out of that. That led me to understand that a number of human lineages or these human species on the family tree should not exist, that we need to really cut off. Well, in the end, it's going to be quite a lot of human species, probably about a dozen, that need to go, that my research invalidates. And then we get up to around...
Let's expand that a little bit. What do you mean by need to go?
You're cut, Graham.
They must go. Yes, they need to go. For example... let me think. Homo habilis, 2.5 million years ago, supposedly the first Homo. Yep.
Is that a
Homo habilis. No, this is tool-using man. He was the first, one of Leakey's discoveries. He's supposed to be the first, hominin that used tools in Africa.
Okay.
And, he's supposed to be essentially a direct ancestor of Homo sapiens. He has to go because we now know from discoveries at another site, which we'll come to, in Georgia, we now know that Homo habilis and a number of other human forms of the ancient past are actually variations of Homo erectus, that Homo erectus had enormous diversity within the species or within that lineage. So as you'd see today, if you think about it, like if I take an African pygmy, and we take perhaps a Mongol, guy, and we take somebody else from, maybe down in the jungles of South America, and we compare these people, we're going to see, some really stark physical differences, whether it's in height, build, the structure of the face, there's an awful lot of diversity within our current human species, right? Yeah. Whereas in the past, people seem to have assumed that there wasn't. And so every time they find a new skeleton, there's a temptation to say, well, I found a new species. Look how different it is. Well, the problem is that we now know that there was massive diversity within Homo erectus. And so in basically almost every hominin from around 3 million years ago to a little after 2 million years ago, more recent than that, should probably be categorized now as Homo erectus. And so all of these hominins in that large cluster there are really invalidated.
So everything between Australopithecus and Homo sapiens should be Homo erectus.
Basically, I give them two. I mean, I say there should be Homo australopithecus at the beginning, and then I think that around about 2.5 million years ago, we see the emergence of early Homo erectus, and that from then on until about, I suppose up until about a million years ago, roughly, we see Homo erectus, essentially. So, I mean, there's this almost singular line. I'm not going to say that there's no offshoots from that. There probably are some examples which we could say, perhaps that's different enough that we'd say that's a species, but there's only going to be maybe one or two that remain as possible separate species. You know, there's such a different lineage that we can say, maybe, but really most of them have to go. That's
okay, I see what you mean. Yeah,
that's a huge rewrite, because when we see these pictures of the human family tree with all these branches, and I think that's wrong. I think we have to call that out and say, look, that's not supportable anymore.
Right.
At what point do you think we cross that boundary into something different? Like,
you mean
where back? Now, if you dropped like most of the human race into the elements, they'd probably die within a couple of weeks.
What are you getting at?
Like at what point do we become a different, like a Homo sapien something?
Beyond
I don't think that we really see
because once does technology change it?
Well, not really. I mean, we had the same technology for a very long time. From, if you say 3.3 million years ago, we had basically, stone choppers.
Yeah, I think that when we were pounding stones. Yeah.
Yeah, so from 3.3 million years ago, we had that up until probably, within the last million years. I mean, we had, some adaptations of that. We had, we started to have bifacial blades instead of, single-faced blades, and, we made better choppers and whatnot. But again, that's over a vast period. I mean, when you talk about a million years, isn't it? And you think of our civilizations, which have been around for technically about 6,000 years. I know that we've had past civilizations, that's another subject, but in terms of the rise of Sumeria and Egypt, in our 6,000 years, we can see what we've achieved. But I mean, when you think of 6,000 versus a million, and I mean, there's that's a long time, and it's to say you're using the same tools for a million years. I mean, we weren't really very adaptive in that way. We didn't, we weren't producing a lot of technology. We weren't really worried about, getting a better chopper. It's like, I can chop my meat with that. That's fine. Or, I'll give it to my kid and he'll chop his meat with it. There doesn't seem to have been that spark in the mind to really do much. So I don't think that the technology changed us very much. It's not until, after over 2 million years of doing much the same that we even start to do anything different. And I'd say that that's near to that point where the Homo sapiens type, arises, which is around 1 million years ago. And I'll just quickly give the background to that. So we say we have this, in my view, we have this emergence into the world of these early Homo, at least 3 million years ago. Again, we're going to hear some controversial material here, because fairly recently there's been a discovery in India at a site where they have now found stone choppers in situ alongside bones that have cut marks. Yeah. So this place is Homo in India around 3.3 million years ago, the same time as the earliest tool use in Africa. Now, this is something that hasn't been well publicized, but when you ponder that for a minute, it's like, well, so then at this point, what is the basis to say that we emerged in Africa? Which is, again, I don't go into that particularly in the book, because at the time I hadn't happened on that piece of information, but that in itself is a game changer, because now we can't even say that the earliest signs of Homo are in Africa. They're equally in Asia.
Exactly.
So,
wow.
So we have this problem, but then anyway, we see this expansion around then that these Homo erectus essentially seems to be the main wanderer. We find him up in Georgia 1.8 million years ago, and also in Africa around the same time, about 1.8 million years ago. Down in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, that area, similar time, around 1.8 million years ago. Again, though, most likely he's expanding from that same population that we're now seeing in India. And there's every chance that Africa is being colonized from Asia at that early stage. We no longer can say that these are all coming out of Africa. So this is, again, is an uncertain area as to where are these people coming out of? Are they coming out of Africa, or are they migrating into Africa from Asia? So again, the landscape is completely changing. And beyond that, though, we see by around just shy of 1.8 million years to 2 million years ago, we have Homo erectus spread across the world. The next significant development in this timeline from my research would be around about 1 million years ago down in Southeast Asia. We see a crucial event happen, and that's the first journeys on watercraft. And for me, that's a big leap, because until recently, it was only accepted that modern humans, fully modern anatomical humans, were able to sail in any sense. And that was around 50,000 years ago that they sailed into Australia. And that is supposed to be the first time, a human got on any kind of watercraft and sailed. Now we're seeing that there were some kind of hominins able to travel around in the islands of Indonesia and get to Flores. And we know that Flores was always cut off from mainland Asia. So before anyone sort of thinks, well, hang on a minute, sea levels were lower, people walked there. It's like, no, there's really deep trenches in that area. It's never been, one mass. So somebody somehow makes about, they argue about, I think it's about 3 or 4 journeys it has to be to get to Flores. One of them about 100 kilometers, at sea, and manages to get there and found this population of Homo floresiensis, these hobbit, right? People. Yeah. That's right. And we have tools there from over 1 million years ago. So, we don't know that the oldest tools are associated with the hobbits. They may be Homo erectus tools, or they may be tools from somebody else. But certainly the first hominins arrive on the island over 1 million years ago. So we've got somebody that seems to have been able to sail 1 million years ago. So that is a profound shift. From 50,000 years ago, the first sailing, to 1 million years ago.
Oh, wow, there's so many questions. So so I think I just wanted to summarize this. So the Homo erectus that you're talking about, kind of more of a broader category, I guess, is what you're thinking. But there's still a bunch of different, would you say, races within that? Like, it's still large variety of lineages under like Homo erectus, right?
Yeah, like, for example, you see distinct forms. Yeah.
So, for example, like the 3 million year old African compared to the 3 million year old Asian or Indian. Yeah, that would be a different lineage, probably.
Yeah, because for example, if you look again at Homo erectus in Africa versus in Asia, for quite a while there was the belief that we had 2 separate species. That there was Homo erectus was basically the Asian form, whereas there was another form in Africa, which has gone from my mind for a moment now. But yeah, it was given a separate name, basically, and that they assumed that these 2 forms were 2 distinct species. And now it's better accepted that, actually, these are the same, but they just had enough physical difference in the structure of the skeletons that there was this belief for a considerable period that we were talking about 2 separate species. Okay. So yes, we certainly had these distinct lineages across regions, but that now we realize that it was like today, that we would have distinct lineages across regions. That we can look at an American Indian and compare them to I guess like a Tibetan or something, and we can see that they've got adaptations to where they are. If the mountain people have adaptations to that environment, and plains people have their adaptations. So yeah, it was more like that you could see there was distinct differences enough that if you saw those 2 skeletons, you might think, oh, are these 2 different species? But we know today now that those would both be just modern humans. Right. So yeah, the same existed back then.
So how does then like Denisovans and Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthals fit into this? Just as far as the getting away from like the Homo erectus, like does that fall into those same categories, or is that a separate line?
Well, again, if we follow on from a million years ago, because we're getting close to that, so we've got these people that have made it to Flores. Something special's going on because, obviously people have started to sail. And I'll just add there that, it's hard to imagine a group of people coming up with this idea of watercraft and of traveling and, repopulating a distant island without some form of communication. And I think that we have to, at this point, say that they are able to communicate, because I don't believe you can convince your group just to go, water, and you all start swimming wildly towards that. There's something complex happening at that point. And I believe that they are able to communicate. They're communicating the idea that something better is over this dangerous water, that it's worth trying to get there, and that, we can construct this project together to move our tribe to that island. There's something going on here. There's like an awakening of the mind.
Yeah.
So I think we've got communication, and I think we've got watercraft, and the tools are starting to, improve. They've also got fire use by now. So we're starting to talk about fairly similar beings to us. And then a key finding in that region as well, which is a bit later on. I mean, I'm going to flick ahead and then back, because they've found a shell in Indonesia which is over 500,000 years old, and it has a sort of basically engraved with some symbols on it, which looks rather like what they call crosshatch, lines, crossed lines with another lines through the middle, kind of, so it's crosshatch patterns. So this shows that also there was abstract thinking by 500,000 years ago in that region. So we know that somewhere in that time, between 1 million years ago to 500,000 years ago, we even have abstract art appearing. So obviously there's something underway here in that region. But the other thing about these people in Flores is that they've crossed the Wallace Line, and the Wallace Line is a really important geological border between all the flora and fauna of Asia and that of Australasia. And the idea is that once you cross the Wallace Line, which has some really powerful currents moving from the north down into the south, so it's always stopped, life spreading across, more or less. Some small animals have made it across, like rats and stuff. But that once you cross that line, you are very close to Australia. And that there is an argument that once you are across, there's no reason why you wouldn't move into Australia. And now you've got this vast continent just down to your southeast, that there's literally no reason to believe that these hominins would not have moved into Australia. And this is a controversial area, which some scientists are now recognizing. They're saying, well, look, if we say that when humans crossed the Wallace Line, they went straight down into Australia, and now they're talking about Denisovans haven't done the same, because the Denisovans, they know there's interbreeding in that area, which we're going to come to. So there's every reason to think that, if these early hominins 1 million years ago made it across the Wallace Line, that they also made it into Australia. And that's we're heading towards, obviously, where my theory goes. And that is that basically that they were in Australia, and that probably very close to 1 million years ago, at least, that they were there already and spreading across the continent. We had something like a Homo erectus on the continent. And then we see around about 900,000 years ago to 800,000 years ago, we see a sudden, very fast evolutionary changes occurring in these early humans. And this is where we start to see the emergence of the three better known lines, if you like, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Sapiens. They all begin to diverge around this time. We now know that because there's been a couple of discoveries in the last few years, which have basically really redrawn the picture for us, because until recently it was believed that Homo sapiens diverged away from Neanderthals about somewhere around 400,000 years ago. 500,000 maybe. And up until then, we shared this ancestor, most likely a Homo erectus-like ancestor, and then we started to split probably somewhere. Neanderthals tend to be thought of as a Western Asian and European species, and that we'd split somewhere in this line, around that 500,000 years ago, and that they went off and became this sort of Central Asian, and we were in Africa, and all this idea. This started to change because we now know from a site in Spain where they've at the let me think, was it Cima de los Huesos site in Spain, where they found these hominins which they thought were for a while they thought they were unique, that they were actually called the Cima hominins, and then there was also thinking that they were Homo heidelbergensis, which was believed to be the ancestor of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And this is another important area that I have to talk about, because this site has really changed everything, because after analysis, of the DNA and of the fossils, eventually they came to the conclusion that these were ancestral only to Neanderthals, and that Homo heidelbergensis is also only ancestral to Neanderthals. And with that, we lost the only, sort of well-accepted precursor to modern Homo sapiens. And we now know that, in fact, the split was much earlier. And these beings are like over 500,000 years old. And they started to realize that, hang on a minute, there's too much evidence that the Neanderthal evolution is well underway by 500,000 years ago, that this split is much earlier. And they now believe they think it's more likely to be around about 800,000 years, 700, 800, maybe even longer ago than that, because the second study that was done, which was a comparative analysis of European fossils, mainly teeth and jawbones. And this project was specifically to find the ancestor of Homo sapiens. And so they took all of these fossils in Europe and they looked for evidence of our evolution there. And what they eventually found was that all of the fossils in Europe are relatives of Neanderthals. They're ancestral to Neanderthals only, and that there is no signs of a Homo sapiens ancestor among these fossils, and that the same hominins in Europe have populations in Africa. So Homo heidelbergensis, erectus, and these forms all supposed to be African and European. And they thought, well, if you haven't got any signs of it in Europe, then you haven't got it in Africa either. So with the one fell swoop, they've removed this possible ancestor, and they said, like, heidelbergensis is an ancestral Neanderthal. And that the second thing in this other project was that they feel the split is as early as 1 million years ago. So there's already this divergence that Homo sapiens as a lineage, a distinct lineage, are already off on their own by around, I'd say, 900,000 years ago to 800,000 years ago. More support is coming with an analysis of Denisovan remains in Siberia. They found that in terms of the genetics, that the two lines have begun to diverge by at least 800,000 years ago. So this is a really well-supported divergence date. It's becoming clear that around this time, we see the emergence of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Sapiens as distinct lineages. Where, again, I'm going to sort of take this towards is, of course, that I say this is happening in Australia, and certainly in Australasia, and to some degree perhaps in Southeast Asia, but mainly in Australasia. And there's a lot of evidence pointing towards that.
And what was the third one? There was the split, the Denisovians, the Neanderthals, and...
Well, there's the Sapiens, and then there's also other lineages. There's, for example, there's a mysterious, what we can call hominin X, that is known only through evidence in the genome at the moment. But they found, you've probably read that they found, evidence of mysterious fourth human species found among Papuans. It was a headline in a number of articles that came out in the last year, and they found that there's basically, yes, if you look at the people of the island of Guinea, which obviously now Papua New Guinea and, been split down the middle. But the island of Guinea has a very peculiar population in respect to its genetics, because they have the usual levels of Neanderthal, which is around about 2 to 3% of the genome is Neanderthal genetics. But they also have up to 6% of what seems to be Denisovan genetics. But amongst that 6%, there is evidence that there's at least 2 forms, that there's Denisovans and a cousin of Denisovans that is closer to Denisovans than it is to Neanderthals, but again is distinct. So they have at least 3 forms within. I'm going to say they probably have more. There's a reason for that we'll come to later, but that they have at least 3 forms there. I mean, this is quite mind blowing. You start thinking, well, so how many types of humans were there down there? And I think there's an awful lot. I think that we're just scraping the surface at the moment. But, so we've got these various forms that have split off. And this is, you've got to think as well, this is really kind of unique in the whole timeline, because it looks like for a very long time we have essentially, more or less one line. We have this fairly clear movement from what I call Homo australopithecus to Homo erectus, and then it's only around about 900,000 years ago that suddenly we get these multiple distinct lineages starting to spread off. So it's I think something very odd and something very different is happening down there. But anyway, it's the first time we really see so many distinct lineages, I think, emerging, at a very similar time in the same place. I mean, it seems to be.
So is there anything that happened back then? Any geological events or any astronomical events that might have happened around 1 million years ago?
There is one actually that I briefly discussed in the book. We know that somewhere around about a little bit over a million years ago, between 1.2 million years ago to around a million years ago, there is a catastrophic die-off of humans across the planet. We don't know what caused it. But we do know that humanity was on its way to extinction, and that with a much smaller population, you do get something called the founder effect, which sometimes leads to like unusual mutations spreading rapidly through a small population. So it would certainly perhaps boost, the changes in a small group. And if you had, a profound mutation happens to occur at that point,
especially if there's a different environment as well.
Yeah, if they move into new environments and there's a small population, maybe the climate has changed as well as part of this die-off. We're not sure what the die-off was, but, so something unusual has happened and it has reduced the population. And then not that long after that, you start seeing this divergence happen. So, I mean, it's interesting. So if we can ever find out what that event was, that may help answer that question. But we know that around 800,000 years ago, we see the fastest observed increase in the brain size, the fastest changes in our physical form. So there's an awful lot seems to happen around that time, the same time as we see these lineages emerging. So something really profound is underway at that time.
So speaking of changes like that, probably one of my favorite chapters of your book was when you talked about Toba and the eruption. When was that again? And then can you talk a bit about what you found like with that? I think that's something that people sort of forget about how incredible that was to the Earth.
Sure. Yeah, it's a leap forward. So, I mean, I'll just say that, yes, let me think what's the best way to...
Yeah, you can get into that later if you want to finish your thought now on this other stuff.
Well, yeah, I suppose, if I take it forward from, so if we have these lineages starting to split 800,000 years ago, and again, remember, this is 600,000 years before we're supposed to have emerged, in terms of out of Africa theory. So people just sort of keep that contrast in mind, that I'm giving the human line an extra 600,000 years of evolutionary time here. So an awful lot is going on, an awful lot more than we've ever really paid mind to. So we have at some point these lines would start to move out into the world. And the way I see this is I believe that you've got to keep in mind as well that we're in Ice Age time. So prime real estate on planet Earth in these periods is around the equator. You don't want to be too far north, too far south. So one of the areas that is very attractive, of course, is that Indonesian, like the Indonesian islands, Southeast Asia and Northern Australasia, right? So you're going to have the major population centers up there. The people are going to move north up, into those regions. The oldest lineages would be up there first, I suppose you could say, or the most dominant. I suspect that what we have is Neanderthals, or the ancestors Neanderthals, moving up into East Asia and parts of Southeast Asia, and that then we have across Indonesian islands and also in Southeast Asia and in Guinea, which at the time was joined to mainland Australia, that we have Denisovans, and then further to the south we have the larger grouping of Sapiens, and that these essentially they have their own territories, which we can imagine. They've got different lineages, they look different. They're going to bond together. They're going to have their own tribal regions. And so, if you imagine for a moment, we've got basically Neanderthals at the top, then we've got the middle Denisovans, then we've got our Sapiens. So we're starting to see this kind of break away into separate, groups. And then this kind of sets us up for what you're talking about with the Toba event, because if we sort of move forward, leap through time, and obviously I'm not going to discount then in this time other groups may have wandered off elsewhere into the world, and that's I think quite likely. But the main collection of humans is there until around 200,000 years ago. 200,000 years ago, there is a climatic shift which causes, again, another one of these sort of mass extinctions. And, humans, again, are clobbered, and taken down to very small numbers. And I see in my data evidence for a migration out of that region at that time west towards Africa. And this is the first of the into-Africa migration events. And I argue in the book that basically, that the founding of Africa occurs at that point. And this is when, you start to collide with the mainstream, because they say, yes, Homo sapiens first appears in Africa 200,000 years ago. I absolutely agree. I do agree with them. But I just say they walked in, because interestingly enough, where do you see the first Homo sapiens in Africa? Do you know off the top of your head?
No.
In
South
East Africa. No, in East Africa. The first Homo sapiens, what they call Homo sapiens adultu, the archaics, they appear in East Africa. The later, fully anatomically modern humans seem to appear, in South Africa around 70,000 years ago. But these very early ones are in East Africa. And so if you were going to walk into Africa, where do you hit? You hit East Africa. And they're right there, right where you would enter the continent. In fact, if you crossed what they call the Bab el-Mendez Straits, basically from the Middle East, you cross into Africa and you end up bang smack, really, where these finds have been made. And so this, again, raises a problem, because why is it that supposedly, we originate there, we've taken over the continent and we've migrated out. Why is it all the finds seem to be concentrated in East Africa? Why aren't we finding all these ancient finds in Central Africa and West Africa? It's a big continent, isn't it? There's plenty of room there. So if we're not flooding the continent, if there's not evidence of us all over the continent, there's something a bit funny about this idea that we had to migrate out at that point anyway, because it seems like we had an awful lot of room to move around in. And yet there's this concentration in East Africa. And again, I say this is because we've walked into the continent at this point. So 200,000 years ago, the founding of Africa, but there's also humans that have remained in Australasia. So this is the first of the important inter-Africa migrations, but it's not the only one, because then, of course, yes, later on, there's this enormous event, 74,000 years ago at the best dating. The Lake Toba supervolcano rumbles into life and produces the largest recorded volcanic eruption of the last couple of million years. Absolutely catastrophic. You can imagine it's equivalent to a nuclear winter. The temperatures plummet. There's rains of sulfuric acid. There's total devastation of plant life, animal life. Horrific. Now, where have I already put the biggest population?
What year was that?
That's about 74,000 years ago.
Okay.
And so where are at that point the biggest concentrations of humans in my hypothesis? They're right there next to the volcano. They're in Indonesia, they're in Southeast Asia, and in northern Australasia. So they are directly in the path of this destruction. So in the immediate aftermath, the people on what was then called Sunda, the Sunda Plate. You have two plates, Sunda Plate, Sahul Plate. Keep in mind here that the sea levels were over 100 meters, lower. So you've got a lot more land in these areas. Sunda was a vast continent. What we see now is that the lower part of Southeast Asia, with this little, string of land going out into the sea, was an enormous plate. So you could have easily had millions of people living on it, technically. I mean, I'm not saying they were, but you could have supported a vast population. I mean, think today, how many people live in Southeast Asia on much less land? So, enormous populations. So, I mean, we're talking about potentially an enormous population living on this Sunda Plate.
That lines up with, what's the one, not Atlantis, but the other one? Isn't that right where Lemuria should have been?
Well, they say Atlantis and Mu. I mean, I've avoided discussion of those names in the book only because they're problematic, aren't they? Because people just say, well, you're pulling these names out, but until you prove the civilization exists, how can you name it, and all the rest of that? But it lines up essentially with this lost civilizations kind of model, whether it's Atlantis, Mu, that we start getting this idea that a land that was lost to flood and catastrophe, and this echo down the timeline. It gives you a real world model for that kind of destruction.
Yeah, and you're talking. What were you saying? The sea level went up like 500.
At least 100 meters.
100 meters. That's a lot.
Yeah, when you think of that, it's a lot.
30 feet.
It's a lot. Yeah, you can imagine. I mean, huge amounts of land were lost. I mean, particularly in that region. I think, as I understand it, the greatest loss of land at the rising, at the end of the Ice Age, was in this region. I mean, this plate was enormous. And Australasia was much bigger. There was far more land around Australia. So, I mean, these two plates, between them, they lost vast amounts of land. So, I mean, under the water there's no doubt huge amount of evidence of human life in that area. And we know that humans tend to be coast hugging. Certainly in the past, they were coast hugging, because the easy access to fish and to, you tend to get more rain around the coast as well. So, if you're relying on, plant life as well. Usually you get, fertility, you got access to water. We tend to be coast dwellers.
Partially aquatic.
So the evidence goes under the water. And this destruction event, it would have literally wiped clean most of, Southeast Asia. I mean, the understanding is now that really the main effects, obviously there's an immediate surrounding, totally destroyed. You've got the rapid flows of magma, you've got the rapid flows of burning hot gases, then you've got the rains of, sulfuric acid. The immediate environment is destroyed. They think wiped clean pretty much of all life. Nothing could survive. As you move out, further away, you've got the after effects. You've got these roiling clouds, of dust, huge amounts of dust. We're talking, I can't remember the figures offhand. I can probably pull it up, but certainly an enormous amount of dust that is going into the atmosphere, and it's blocking out the sun. It's moving to the northwest. So anyone living in that line of fire, basically up through Southeast Asia, into East Asia, across into Eurasia, most of Eurasia, is getting the brunt of this, as it moves. As this cloud moves into the atmosphere and it starts to roll around the northern hemisphere of the planet, there's a huge temperature drops. They know from ice cores that some places fell like 13 degrees, and this is in an ice age. I mean, there's areas that would have just become totally inhospitable. And so you've got basically anyone who is to the northwest or north really as well into the west of the volcano, is in dire trouble. They're probably going to be wiped out, or they have to move very fast. There's immediate migrations. The rain would come black. You'd be like, we've got to go. Things are dying. We can't drink the water. It's, if you were lucky enough to get some kind of warning, you would move or die.
Yeah.
So you've basically lost whoever was living in that region is dead. Then you go to the south. The effects are less. So anyone who was down below Guinea and down into Australia, basically, Northern Australia, I think, and Guinea would have been severely impacted. They might not have been wiped out, but they would have been severely impacted. Probably mega tsunamis, earthquakes, all the rest of it as well. So as you move further south into Australia, they had it was survivable there. They wouldn't have had that same impact because of the direction of basically of the dust clouds. They were going northwest. So in the end, the whole northern hemisphere of the Earth has this blanket of dust. It starts to move up in the atmosphere and it spins around as, the movements of the air currents. In the end, the dust cloud spreads out and is covering most of the northern hemisphere of the planet. So consider again as well that you're in an ice age. The best place to be is the equator anyway. So it was already hard up there. Now it's pretty unlivable. And so there's two areas where humans are surviving. Because I've already put humans in Africa 200,000 years ago. You have a community of humans already there, both Homo sapiens and archaics. There's probably still groups of erectus and some of these others that are still there. They haven't necessarily all died out just because we've appeared. But any groups of those that moved south would be all right. They only need to walk south, so they don't get that hugely impacted. Certainly the North Africans, the far north, they probably were wiped out. But as you move down to the south, they're all right. So you can get a movement of humans in towards South Africa, which, as we know, is basically where you find evidence of Homo sapiens, fully modern humans, around 70,000 years ago, as you mentioned earlier, that's where you find them in South Africa. And that's, I'd say, for that region, that they've kind of moved that way. And then elsewhere, in Australia, you're going to have another group there. And these are called, this again, you have the founder effect, again, in play here, when populations are changed to being, very small from being very large. You have the preservation of a snapshot of the genetic diversity of the time. Obviously, some lines are completely gone. Some get preserved. You lose a lot of the diversity that existed. And in one fell swoop, you may have lost, thousands and thousands of genetic lineages. And so it starts to look like there was less diversity in that region. Africa preserves most of its existing diversity because it is not impacted, not strongly. So what we see today, for that reason, is we see South Africa, people look at the Africans and they look at the genetic diversity and say, well, look, they have huge diversity in their lineages. And it's like, well, yeah. And he says, they do. And I agree. You would expect that. But it's not because that they are necessarily the founders of all humanity. It's because they were in an area where they didn't lose all their diversity. They preserved it. And also they would have absorbed diversity from erectus and from other archaic lineages after moving into Africa 200,000 years ago. There would have been some interbreeding with any other lines still there. They then get that diversity as well. So they've boosted theirs, whereas in Australasia and in that region, they've lost loads during this Toba event. They're down to a small population. There's forced migrations. So anyone who survives is moving west or south. If they can't go south, they move west. So we're going to have survivors fleeing towards the Middle East and, of course, into Africa. And this is the second Into Africa event, that around about 74,000 years ago, we see a population of fully anatomically modern humans arriving in Africa. And I'd say in two places. I believe some of them made their way around the coastlines and they entered again across this Bab el-Mandab Strait into East Africa. But I also suspect that some made their way across open ocean, island hopping, and ended up at Madagascar and then entered what could be the eastern South African coast, where we see all these caves like Border Cave and the famous sites of early humans, early modern humans in Africa. And that's why if you look at the map and you look where these caves are, they're exactly where you'd expect watercraft to land in Africa if they were escaping from Indonesia.
So, and that sea level rise would have been permanent.
Well, the sea level rise comes later. No, this is still during the ice age. In fact, it got colder after the event, so we had more ice.
No, but you're talking, Darren. Are you talking about the sea level rise from the from that specific Toba eruption?
Yeah.
They wouldn't have had much sea level rise from that because there wasn't much ice in that region. So we would have seen tsunamis and stuff, but no, not really necessarily. This isn't when the sea level rise happened. The sea level rise doesn't happen until the melting of the ice 12,000 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, so at this point, we're just seeing a sort of a catastrophe, which in some ways, would probably build ice in some areas because of this intense cold in the northern hemisphere, that we'd actually see an increase in ice. But there would have been immediate flooding from tsunamis and stuff, but we wouldn't have seen this permanent rise at this point. And again, major earthquakes, it's quite possible that some of the land did, drop, because as you know, sometimes when we have catastrophic earthquakes, whole pieces of land, go under the water or rise up. And so, we don't know for sure the geological impact on the plate. It may have been that parts of the plate did go under the water, permanently at that point.
Like Krakatoa, that's kind of what happened, I think. I read this book from Simon Winchester. Darren, you'd be interested in this for how things repopulate, right? It was gone, and then the lava started rebuilding the island itself. And they watched firsthand, here's a new island being formed, and how quickly it got populated with birds and animals, and it was crazy. Instantly, stuff growing on it. Pretty much just watching evolution happen right in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
Life finds a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, nature takes advantage of a situation,
And that tsunami killed 40,000 people in 1883.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
and you think this is, and as they point out, you contrast the two. I mean, the Toba event was, it was way bigger. It was an enormous disaster.
Yeah.
So I mean, at this point, you've got this massive movement of people around. I've got it here. Let me see. So they say it was around 73,880 years ago is what they've dated it to. And just to give you a few of the little statistics and bits of information for this. So they say the most powerful eruption of the last 2.5 million years, involving 14 days of eruption with multiple eruptions, and producing 800 kilometers cubed of ash. You've got to try and imagine that for a moment. 800 cubic kilometers of ash being pumped up into the atmosphere, and that millions of square kilometers of land were covered in debris. Wow. So I mean, it makes these other eruptions, look trivial. They think that the magma produced was 2,800 cubic kilometers.
Yeah, that's crazy.
These are some big, crazy numbers. If you can imagine big cubes of, kilometer-sized, cubes of magma, 2,800 cubic kilometers. This is a disaster beyond imagining. That it's hard to understand how anyone in this region has survived. But the human race was devastated. There is, goes without saying, because it's just.
Well, not even locally, but it's got to affect the whole global climate and everything. I mean, everything would be messed up there for a while, for a few years, you know?
Oh, absolutely. And it did go on for many years. I mean, it took years and years to begin to reverse. I mean, for a while, it catapulted what was already a cooling period, it made it much cooler. So, I mean, you lost a few degrees of, heat in some areas, as they say. In some areas, it was less, maybe a degree, but overall, the Earth climate dipped by a couple of degrees. I mean, and that's fairly profound. When you're in an ice age already, these kind of changes are catastrophic. They can be the difference between, plant life growing that year or not growing. That last degree can wipe out your main food source. This was really, as I say, a disaster beyond reckoning. And the few that were lucky enough to survive on the edges of the disaster in terms of the north and to the west, they would have had to have, pretty much packed up and run, scavenging what you can on the way, heading until you get away from that roiling cloud that's following you. It's a nightmare scenario. One of the things that we see there again is that I believe that we are seeing some remnants of these people. We call them perhaps the Sundanese, which are these. If you're aware of the what they call the Negrito people, I'm not sure if you know. There's these sort of pygmies and these small-bodied black people of Southeast Asia. You have these Negritos, and they live on. Well, you've got some in the Philippines. You've got some in Thailand. You've got, there's a few scatterings of these small groups of tribal peoples. Usually, not huge groups, and they are diminutive in size. A bit over a meter, and look quite what we'd think of as typically African. Very dark-skinned with sort of curly hair but very small. And I'm of the strong opinion that these are the remnants of one of the major groups that were, in Sunda. In this, these are the kind of, the leftovers of what was once a larger population group, and certainly in terms of the humans. But I imagine that they are, I suppose we'd say remnants of multiple lineages. I mean, certainly some of the genetic evidence suggests that some of these groups are carrying lineages of not only of like Neanderthal and Denisovan, but other unknown lineages are found in Negritos. So they now understand that these are quite unique people. And that, it was long assumed that these are Africans, that had moved into the region around 70,000, 60,000 years ago, because we know that they seem to be genetically isolated, certainly on some of the islands, for 60,000, 70,000 years, which is obviously incredibly ancient lineages. And you'd think that they'd be very African. And they certainly look how we expect like African pygmies to look. But ironically, what they've actually found in some cases is that they are carrying very ancient Asian lineages of DNA, and that it makes them appear to have been very much Asiatic peoples, and yet they look very much like the African pygmies. Again, I argue that that's because these are the ancestors of the African pygmies, and in fact they're moving west, they're not moving east, and that we've got it around the wrong way, that they're carrying these lineages with them, this Denisovan and stuff, which are coming out of Asia. I'll go on to Denisovans, because obviously Denisovans, you've raised, and they're a fascinating species, and they're not well understood yet, but they're important in this story because the Denisovans, at first, we've detected them in Siberia and from a few bones there in the what they call the Denisova cave.
From Denis, the Russian guy named Denis or something, I think.
That's right. Yeah, like a sort of mystic that lived in the cave, and so they've like named the whole species after him, which is kind of cool. Isn't it? So basically, like I guess, like it's like having a kind of tramp living in a cave, or something, and he's got his name to the whole species. I don't know how that happened, but I don't know. It's kind of funny. But,
your name will live on.
Maybe he wasn't a tramp. That's pretty unfair. I don't know, but yeah, a guy that lived in a cave. Yeah, now they've named the whole species after him. And that basically, that's what they found was that, amongst these bones in the Denisova cave, there was evidence of, modern humans, Neanderthals, and this other species, which they found, obviously from doing analysis of the just of these finger bones and teeth. And they discovered that, there was Denisovans, this whole other human lineage, they consider another human species, I'd say lineage, and that they are distinct from us, that they've been around for at least, let's say 800,000 years. And in fact, they also carry evidence of yet another lineage in these bones, which is not Denisovan. Another unknown species has been detected in the Denisova bones, which is a point that hasn't been well discussed. But, again, there's more of these lines getting detected. But anyway, so we know that there was this other group wandering around. But the interesting thing about this is that when they went to find, where's the evidence today of them, so they started doing testing, obviously, on people in that region. No sign of the genetics. So they did testing on Europeans, no sign of, Denisovan DNA in us. And so eventually they've detected that there is Denisovan among East Asians, but at a very low level, like 0.1% of the genome of East Asians, is a fairly typical figure. And the only place that you find a significant signature is in like Guinea and Northern Australia. And like that really is kind of mind-bending for the conventional academics, because it's not what they're expecting. They want this to be like an, a Central Asian hominin, related to Neanderthals. That Neanderthals are European, Denisovans are kind of Central Asian, and that makes sense in their model. But what they're finding instead is that, Denisovans are uniquely seen among people in Australasia, and like that's a problem, because why is that then? How can that be? This is like an anatomically modern human, like us basically, and it's not in Africa, it's not in Europe, it's not up in Central Asia, it's all the way down in South, down beyond Southeast Asia, right into Australasia. In fact, we're finding it, and they also know that the interbreeding between Denisovans and Homo sapiens, or modern humans, happened around about 44,000 years ago. So we know that they were still around until then. By about 30,000 years ago, we think that them and Neanderthals and stuff were, pretty much gone. But this raises another problem, because humans are only supposed to have got into Australia 50,000 years ago, as I mentioned earlier. And at this point, they're supposed to have become completely isolated. So, a few people on their boats have made their way across from Indonesia, and that's it. The door closes, no one else enters the continent, and they're on their own from then until really, fairly modern times. But how can that be? If 44,000 years ago, they're interbreeding with a completely different lineage, this other group of humans who are considered another species, it's not just another group of people wanders in, but there's this unique interbreeding event going on only on their continent, and it's after the isolation has started. So now, I don't know about you, but I don't know how you interbreed when you're isolated, do you? I mean, it's usually a fairly, physical kind of interactive event, isn't it? So, I mean, I don't know how they can do it, but whilst they're being isolated.
Huh. Yeah, it's interesting. So
technically, does that mean that Denisovians should be Homo Denisovians?
They are Homo, but this is what we're getting at there. And you're quite right. So really, we're talking about Homo sapiens Denisova, Homo sapiens Neanderthal. Like Homo sapiens sapiens.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Yeah, it's exactly where I'd be taking this to. I don't believe that we're talking about separate species. I think that we are talking, all of these are Homo sapiens. We are all wise man. These Denisovans are making complex jewelry. They've got this bead they found in the cave, which is fast drilled, by using what I think they call it bow drill. Like, imagine a stick with if you have like a bow,
twine on it.
Yeah, wheeling up the Homo sapien ladies.
Yeah, so well, there was obviously there's something, there's obviously something going on there. There's been attraction, probably, maybe there's this thing of, oh, well, they look different, but certainly there's interbreeding goes on between all of these groups, and that they are having successful offspring. We know they are because their genomes recorded in us. So clearly it's successful interbreeding, and that, I think we all originate in Australasia, all from the same ancestor. We're still able to interbreed, i.e., we're talking about just different lines of Homo sapiens, and then we have to stop thinking of completely different species. It's the wrong way to think of it.
Yeah, it makes it seem like we're looking at this chart here to the imaginative road to Homo sapiens, where it's just got all the different kind of heights and crouches of all the different lineages all the way up, and it's almost like they wanted us to think that it's a bunch of different species, to fit the evolutionary theory that the dogma that's there. If you rename every one like that, instead of doing what you're thinking, which is, calling it all one type and just different lineages, right? It gives it a different, a whole different feel and look.
Yeah, and Homo erectus, even if we go back to him, he's not really that different to us. I mean, again, if we say he can sail his little boats about 1 million years ago, and he is most likely communicating, and is, by 500,000 years ago, probably, well, we don't know if it's him or someone else, but someone in that region, in Indonesia, is drawing these patterns and stuff. We're talking about people that basically think kind of like us, that they want to communicate, they sail, they can draw, they're using their fires and stuff. There's a point where you got to say in it, well, it's not really that different to us, is it then? That by 500,000 years ago, we're talking about beings that really are pretty recognizable, and so this idea that we've recently flared into life as this different, unique, human species, really, I think I'd call bullshit on that, because it looks more like that, within the last 1 million years, we've been pretty much, all Homo sapiens, like all wise men or whatever you want to call it. And that, I believe that there's the proto-language, and I go into this in the book, as you will know, is that I think that this click language that we see among the, what they call the Khoisan peoples of South Africa, that they use these languages involve clicks, whistles, hand gestures, and some words. Now, there's been a couple of academics who've argued that this is the oldest language in the world, and it shows complexity beyond other languages, that we've lost complexity in a way over time, that this is a proto-language. And I absolutely agree, and I think this makes most sense, because before we gain, say, the anatomy that allows for complex pronunciation of, various words, that we would have still been able to make sounds, and we would have heard animals making sounds. Replicating birds is one of the key theories at the moment in terms of, they think, the evolution of language, that perhaps we heard these bird sounds and that our first languages incorporated some of these whistle sounds, and that we, in a way, we took our language from birds. And I strongly believe that. And funnily enough, there's if you look at particularly the Aboriginals, so there's this tradition that we are the bird tribes, and they say there was a tribe that spoke only in bird songs, apparently, now extinct or hidden in the jungles, but there is these legends, if you like, or claims that we are bird tribes and bird people. And some of the earliest shamanic traditions are of bird shamanism. I mean, they found now that, I think it's the Neanderthals, they wore the Denisovans or Neanderthals, but they had these black cloaks, their feathers that they used to wear and stuff. So there seems to be this strange intimate relationship between early humans and birds. And I think that we took these whistle sounds and we used that as a language you could use in hunting, because, of course, if you're making bird whistles and stuff, you don't start or game, for a start. So it's a very useful hunting language. But also, there's a lot of complexity in the sounds you can make, the different whistles and stuff. And we found that with clicking, whistles, animal sounds, and a few hand gestures was sufficient to communicate the kind of ideas you need to communicate 1 million years ago. Obviously, you don't need to explain things in the intimate detail we do today. Like, for me to have this conversation with you, I need to have like thousands of words or whatever, hundreds of words. But for you and I to go and hunt a wild pig, we probably don't need that kind of language, but we need to be able to communicate, look, it's going over there, or I'm over here, and, go that way quietly, and more simple ideas, I suppose. And that language would have certainly provided that complexity enough for that. And interestingly enough, you find there's evidence of this same language in Australia, there's some islands out in the, bit off the coast of, I think it's off in northeastern Australia, in that area, that there's some islands there where they found that there was remnants of a click language, but it was only being used ceremonially in modern times, and it's now considered a borderline extinct language, but it was retained as a ceremonial language by initiated men. So we know that these click language existed in Australasia. There's also evidence for click language down in the south of Argentina and down in Tierra del Fuego. When Darwin was actually down in that area, he noted in his letters that the people there made all these clicking and guttural sounds, and they were barely human and all this. But again, what he seems to be recording appears to be the remnants of another one of these click languages, and he's saying they made all these wild gestures, and it's like, well, hang on a minute, this is the same archaic language. And the people of Tierra del Fuego have been identified as potential remnants of Australoid people in South America. So again, we're getting closer to this fact, I think, that these original Australian people who were the founders of language as well.
So what's the type of percentage genetic wise for some of these groups of people, like let's say the Negritos or these pygmies, or even maybe like Aboriginal Australias, or like what's their percentage? That's like, how high are they of just one type? Because I mean, it surprises me when you say like 6% and 2% of some of the other ones that have some of them the higher percentages. So what are we talking about? And then there's the rest of it, just all these unknown other factors, like.
Yeah, basically, yes. I mean, that's what I'm leaning towards. I think that at the moment we would keep saying, well, okay, we are, let's say we find a guy in Guinea and he's got particularly high levels of Neanderthal, Denisovan and Denisovan relatives. Say he's 10% archaic. So let's say he's got 10% archaic hominin genome, right? And so when we'd say, okay, well, the other 90% is Homo sapien, right? But how do we know that? What is Homo sapien? It gets to that point, you got to say, well, what's that then? Because if the next DNA, project finds that there's another one in there, and then the next one finds another one in there, and there's another one, like, you say, oh, and then we're 3% this and 3% too, like, oh, but we're 70% sapien, oh no, we're 50% sapien.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
In the end, what does that mean? That, we are human, we are the remnant of all these species, all these, not species, lineages. We are what's left.
We're all mixed. Like all the races are mixed to a certain extent. It seems like
that's right.
There's no pure.
There's no pure, and we don't know that Denisovan even looked different to us. I mean, that's another point, because we only have, we've got like, a few bones, some finger bones, some teeth. The most we can say is that the specific Denisovans that have been found in Siberia had big teeth. Doesn't mean they all had big teeth. So we can't even say that they were all like big teethed and different to us. It may just be that they've happened to find individuals in a population that were, had larger teeth. That Denisovans may have looked almost identical, or if not identical, to how we look. We don't know that. So it's entirely possible that we just look like all these other groups looked like, and that we incorporate all of what was left of their diversity, and that there was multiple lineages, and there could be 100 lineages from that region that now make up modern humans. And I'm going to say something about Guinea, which is interesting as well, particularly, is that not many people know this, but this one island has the largest diversity of languages on the planet. It has like hundreds of separate languages, hundreds. I mean, you've got to think on that. It's like, why would you have hundreds of languages on this one? It's a fairly big island and everything, but that's not normal. That's really not normal to have the highest diversity of all languages in the world is by far seen on Guinea. That suggests that once upon a time, there was way more population groups in that region, and that they have been destroyed down to this remnant. And again, I'm saying that's because to the north, you've had a total wipeout. If you imagine, to the north has been, you've got this empire of the Denisovans, also mixed in with Neanderthals and what we think of as the Sapien lineage, if you like. But these multiple lineages are concentrated mostly on the equator. So they're all throughout the islands there, and this major plate, the Sunda plate, which has been rocked, by this disaster. So of course there's going to be different groups and lineages spread around that area in the first place. And when that happened, you've got just this little group down in Guinea who represent, different little populations within a massive population, and they are the snapshot that is left. Everybody to the north of them is dead, basically. There's a few handfuls that survive here and there, but you've had those wiped out, and those all had their own variations of language, so these languages have come down. Some of these languages have come down from the Denisovans. I would say most of these languages in Guinea are probably Denisovan languages, and that's why we find that they're very unique languages in that region. And so many of them. And again, it further supports this idea that we're talking about a founder effect here, not only of the genetic lineages, but of languages. And I think that if we really start to dig into that, we're going to find that, these people are talking Denisovan.
Oh, now we have emojis. That's a founder effect.
Progressing again.
Yeah. We're going backwards. I don't know. Is it make it more complex or more simple that we have just emojis? Yeah. It's the internet. It's the first language of all cultures.
Yeah, we are changing again. We're becoming post-human next, aren't we? But So I mean, yeah, we have this, I guess, called compelling evidence, in multiple areas, for what's really going on and where it's going on, and obviously my model in general is, centered on Australasia. I'm saying, really everything of greatest interest is happening in Australasia. And so that's, I guess that, remember here as well, I should go back to the out of Africa. The out of Africa theory claims that, the migrations that populated the world happened around about 74,000 years ago. So this is the same period. So they're saying that's when we came out of Africa. I'm saying no, that's when we moved out of Southeast Asia and out of this region, Australasia, because of Toba. There's no event in Africa that would make us move, for a start. Like, why is it that we suddenly start this migration out of Africa, like 74,000 years ago? Because it's a uniquely, this is another thing, guys, it's a uniquely bad time to do a migration out of Africa. Yeah. And this has been recently come out in a couple of papers that basically they've identified as the worst drought, in recorded, history, whatever is going on in the Levant and the Middle East and North Africa at that period, because you've got Lake Taylor, it's exploded, there's a nuclear winter, it's a nightmare, the climate is in collapse, and like they say, at that point, people decided to wander off into the Levant and cross, Asia. I don't buy it. Yeah. It doesn't make any sense. And like the guy says, this is the worst time to move out into the Levant, These are leading academics on, paleoclimatology saying, look, this is like the worst time to do it. Like, no one's going to do it. You don't walk from your lands of plenty into the worst drought in history, innit? No one does it. We have to say these are people that think like us. They look that way and they see rolling green hills. They look that way and they see nuclear devastation. Which way do I go? They're not stupid. I mean, you just don't do that. So what we see instead that does make sense is a forced migration of survivors from Toba who are trapped to the northwest and they have to migrate. And so what we see now is what they call the coastal route. They're saying that they think that humans moved from Africa along the coasts of Asia and then down into Southeast Asia and Australia. Yeah. If you reverse that, it makes sense. Yes, these people hugged the coasts, probably because you could still get some fish and eat. The inland area is devastated, but they're still managing to survive in that tract of just survivable land along the coast, and they're rushing their way, towards Africa. Not necessarily knowing it's there. They may do. There may well be legends, of these earlier migrations, which I suspect there was, because it seems that the Australian Aboriginals have a very good memory for their stories, don't they? And we know now that some of these stories they tell are accurate, depictions of events tens of thousands of years ago. So there's a strong oral tradition. They may have heard, well, there's Africa to the west, run.
Yeah. So
I've heard a few times now that the Aboriginal Australians are the oldest people on the planet.
Absolutely, yeah, and the culture is the oldest. We know that the culture itself goes back, tens of thousands of years. These stories, some of the stories depict, climate changes that happened tens of thousands of years ago, or meteor impacts in a certain area, that these stories have encoded information across vast periods of time, and that there's no other comparable age of any other culture or civilization on the planet. And again, sort of mention here that if you look at the people in South Africa, if you go down to the oldest lineage there, which is the Khoisan people, once known as the Bushmen, but it's a bit sort of an offensive term now. But these Khoisan, they retain some really interesting traditions. For example, one of their most revered figures in their mythology is a giant serpent. Now, who do you immediately think of? You think of a tradition, a revered tradition of a giant creator serpent. Let me think. Oh, that rainbow serpent in Australia. And they've got the same kind of culture going on. It's not there. The things they do are very similar, but this particularly some of the stories they have, echo stories in Australia. I mean, that one is a key one because we know that the original telling of that tale is definitively Australian. That this culture is the most ancient, and it has the most ancient stories of the serpent. And then you have these other incredibly ancient people, the Khoisan, and they tell this same story of this giant creator serpent. They have this click language, and then you find in parts of Australia there was this remnants of a click language. They have. On the other thing I should say is that down in South Africa they found crosshatch patterns on stones. You may know of the what's it called now? It's gone from my mind. But there's some rocks were found in some of the caves down in Southeast Africa, and they got the crosshatch pattern, and it was once claimed that was the first signs of higher thinking. were these stones, and that 70,000 years old or whatever down there. And of course, that's that same pattern that we see on the shell in Indonesia 500,000 years ago. So this is something that's been carried from there. Again, the evidence keeps showing the stories, the art, even the morphology. If you look at them, they look more like Black Asians, like Australasians, than they do Negroids. They're not part of the Negroid population. Like if you take Khoisan people and put them against Negroid people, you'll see that morphologically they are very distinct, and they're also genetically very distinct. So these are the remnants of those Australasians that came in around 70,000 years ago. There's good reason to argue that. And there's the genetics as well, but I don't know if you want me to touch on the genetics. It's a little bit heavy, but I can certainly touch on it. That we find that 70,000 years ago.
I was going to ask if blood type played in at all, or if there's any correlation in blood types.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there's a couple of blood types that are actually missing in Australasia. So that in itself is interesting. And we see some overlaps in Africa, in the areas of Africa which have the lowest levels of those same blood types. And we see that in the regions where the Khoisan are, and on this southeast coast where near to where these cave sites are. So you have correlations in blood type, and then also you have the correlations with what they call the Y chromosomal and mitochondrial DNA. Now, if you look at the argument, the Out of Africa argument says that basically around about, is the emergence of M and N as haplogroups, which are two, like what we call founding lineages of all humans outside of Africa, basically arise from the M and N lineages. Okay, and M and N are considered to be daughters of L3. And there's L0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And beyond that, above that is L, which we don't have examples of anymore, but we assume it's this founder lineage of all the other lines, which we don't know where that was. Obviously, mainstream assumes that it was in Africa. They say we think most likely L emerged in Africa because we see L1, 2, 4, 5, 6, all in Africa, very much African lineages. L3 is a bit more mysterious because L3, as I say, gives rise to M and N, which is everybody outside of Africa comes from L3. L3 first appears around about on the edges of East Africa and the Middle East. And nobody's sure, now even the academics admit they don't know where this first, arose. Did it arise first in East Africa? Did it arise near to East Africa? But what they certainly know is that M and N were never in Africa, and that those are the founder lineages of all, all of the like Americans, Europeans, Asians, anybody non-African basically comes from those lineages, not from the other L lineages, which are distinctly African. So you have immediately there, you have another anomaly, which is strangely enough, we all come from what we'd have to call non-African lineages. And the L3 is not shown to be an African lineage. It moves into Africa around this period. This is why they say, well, we think, it must be African, because there's an expansion of L3 moving west into East Africa, right? That's a good point, it's moving west. So could it be people walking in from the east? They're moving west. It's expanding into the continent. And that this is mainstream saying, expands west into the continent from East Africa. Again, at that same place where you'd expect people to cross, like the Bab el-Mandab Strait into the country, is where we see L3 first. And we see M and N, not actually in the country, moving the other ways, if you like, expanding out. So it's almost like there's an L3 group which undergoes some mutation close to East Africa, and the lot moving in still have L3, but the other groups that are moving in the other directions, there's some changes occur, probably adaptation, mutations as they change, go into new environments, and they become the M and N lineages. And these basically move, throughout the world. Some of the oldest lineages of M are found down in Australasia. We don't know, and also, there's remnants of like L3 and stuff down there. So it's, we know that there's very old, and there's no argument here again, some of the oldest examples of these lineages are Australasian, again. And in fact, there's no argument here as well that the Australasians are considered to be one of the two oldest populations on the planet. There's an argument by the mainstream that basically Khoisan people are the oldest. That not when we talk about Africans, I mean, everyone should think here. I'm not talking about Negroid Africans. Okay, they're young. Okay, there's only one other contender for the oldest people other than Australasians, and that's these Khoisan, a small number of people down in South Africa, versus the Australasians. And at the moment, the geneticists are saying, well, we think these Khoisan are the oldest, and the Australasians are the second oldest. But Europeans, Asians, and other Africans are all much younger, much younger. And this is a key point. We have to say this is accepted. There's no argument here. They're saying that already that probably Australasians are around about 60,000, maybe 70,000 years old. But they think they're not as old, and that in some of the samples in the past it was shown that they were older. But there's, this is a contentious area of debate. But there is no argument beyond that. There's just these two groups, and as I say they're both Australasian anyway, and I don't see them as that distinct. I think we're talking about a group of Australasians in Africa anyway, and that we see there's a much akin in their genetics which would support that. But basically, at this point, Australasia, is, in my view, is expanding out. We've seen this. First of all, we've seen this migration that's followed Toba, but there's a second one because, of course, people have died, right? So if you imagine, okay, yes, there's this lineage has gone into Africa around about that period, 74,000 years ago. There's this influx of migrants, these people that have fled Toba, that they're bringing the L lineages, this L3 into Africa, right? But what we see later, about 60,000 years ago, is another migration, and this is a replacement basically because the continents have been wiped clear. We start seeing small groups of people moving across from Australasia up into Asia, and you can look at this. We're tracking the Y chromosomes and the mitochondrial chromosomes. You'll see that basically these lineages appear first down in Southeast Asia, and there's no argument about this. I mean, they say it appears that some of these oldest lineages sweep up from Southeast Asia into the rest of Asia, particularly what they call, I think it's the C lineage, and this was haplogroup C, and that moves across from that area. And again, the oldest examples appear in Australasia, and there's even morphology to do with the way what we call shovel-shaped teeth, which is comes up from Southeast Asia into East Asia. These populations then, eventually move into Europe. And around about 35,000 years ago is the first Europeans. And obviously they would have swept up north towards, the Bering Bridge, crossing into America. And so we start to see this expansion at that time, around 60,000 years ago. And this is the expansion that populates the world. So I'll backtrack a bit to say this. So basically we have three migrations, three key migrations in the populating of the planet by Homo, anatomically modern humans. 200,000 years ago with the migration from Australasia into Africa, and then at 74,000 years ago with survivors of the Sunda disaster moving either south into Australasia or west to Africa. And then after the impact of Toba has diminished, 60,000 years ago, we see this last expansion, the true colonization of planet Earth, which then just rolls on until today.
So do you think like one of the earlier migrations could account for Aboriginals around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, we see
like the Machu Picchu people and like Native Americans and...
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, I think that what we have in, like the American, like we call North American Indians and stuff, they say, that, they've always been on their land, in the same argument that like Australasians have said, look, we've always been here. And I think there's some truth in that. I mean, I do think that we're starting to see now, I mean, there was a recent news story that you probably saw that humans 130,000 years ago in North America, like breaking open mastodon bones for the marrow.
130,000, yeah. I've seen that.
And
I actually just wrote that down.
There you go. And then also we have an older discovery there, Huatulaco, which was basically a mainstream find that identified human population there in Mexico 200,000 years ago or more. They think it could have been a much older population.
There was so much pits?
They found, I think there was animal bones, evidence of butchery. There was, fire pits, all found across in this area. And then they had the geologists came in, the archaeologists, everybody, and it turned into a big circus because the mainstream wanted to just stamp it all out of existence. It ruined, the careers of some leading academics. And basically they just, they said, look, this can't be true because humans didn't get here till 13,000 years ago, and you're all ruining, our good name of archaeology. And so that basically got whitewashed. But we now see that in that context. Now we're seeing, hang on a minute, 130,000 years ago, someone was breaking open bones just to the north, up into I think it's in California, again, sort of hugging that warm belt, of the equatorial warm belt, and then down in Mexico, right on the equator, really, not far off, down into Ecuador as well. They found some Homo erectus-like remains, and there's been a piece of a Homo erectus skull found in Mexico. So there's a number of finds that don't, they're not really making the press, and they haven't made the peer-reviewed papers, but there is significant evidence to show that archaic hominins of some sort were in the Americas. And I think that the American Indians can rightly say that at least some of their lineage probably does go back to these really, really early humans. Probably they're at least 200,000 years ago, maybe way earlier. I'm not going to discount that maybe they got in there hundreds of thousands of years earlier than that. We just don't know yet. But I think that the American Indians may well have at least part of their genome as being these archaics that go back. And that's why they say we've always been here. I think in some respect, they're probably right. They probably do have. And then they have genetics from a wave of Australoids, these people from Guinea and Australia that have made it into that continent, again, probably around 70,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago. Some of the oldest evidence for humans down in Brazil particularly suggests that we were there at least 60,000 years ago. So I think that we also have genetic lineage for indigenous Americans that goes back 60,000 years. So again, that would give them some argument saying we've always been here. Because that's a pretty long time, isn't it? You can say you're not a recent arrival. All the way through the Ice
Age, before the Ice Age, and through the Ice Age.
Fucking crazy flood.
Yeah.
That's pretty close to always being here, isn't it? You can't really say you're a newcomer if your ancestors have been there 60,000 years. I mean, again, so they probably have lineages from that. Yeah, you're newcomers, And then I think that, yes, then there's later influxes, probably, around 15,000, 13,000 years ago, that have merged. In each case, you have interbreeding and merging. So we know that some of these tribes in the Brazilian Amazon have been shown to have up to 2%, Australasian or Oceanian genetics, and it's an interesting thing here because if you look at there's one of these tribes that they've found this genetic signature in, down in the Brazilian Amazon. I don't have the name straight to my mind, but basically, one of the tribes that's flagged up as having this interbreeding has this really fascinating tradition, right? Because they have this astronomical tradition that when you look up at the Milky Way and you look at that band of stars, they see in the middle of it this local flightless bird. Basically, it's a kind of a relative of the emu, it has the same behavior as the emu and all the rest of it. And they see this stretched across the dark space in the Milky Way, right? What do the Australian Aboriginals say? They say that there's a big emu in the dark space stretched across in the Milky Way. Yeah. Right? Absolutely. The identical astronomical tradition, right? Amongst these people in the Brazilian Amazon who have 2% genetics from these Australoids. So, you're not only seeing this flag of that yes, these Australians came here, but they came there with their culture. This is how old this culture is. That, and they've remembered it, just like they have in Australia, that they've got a remnant of memories of 50,000 or 60,000 years ago of the traditions that came into the continents. That is astonishing. And there's, to argue that this is a coincidence would be nuts. That you just happens that they've got the genetics and the same traditions. It's pretty clear now that we have to start rethinking this. So you have all that going on. And I do think that, there's America is a fascinating area. And I cover that in the second installment of my Forgotten Exodus series, which is mostly written. I have to tidy it up and update it. But yes, there's a lot going on there. Should I touch on a little bit more of America? Because I guess, obviously people are interested.
Yeah, part of that was South America, I guess, included, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I'd say that, from basically the way I look at it is that, this is my research when I was in Ecuador for 5 years and I was researching this megalithic site in the Amazon, which is what, as I say, prompted all of this. What I discovered was that the area where the site exists up in basically this, it's called the Yanganatis National Park, which is, people will know it best because it's supposedly where the lost treasures of the Atahualpa were taken by the Incas when their civilization collapsed to the Spanish. Basically, the remnants of their treasure were supposedly carried into the Yanganatis and are hidden somewhere in this really dangerous, vast area of jungles and mountains there. But anyway, it's in that region is where this megalithic site is as well. I believe the Incas went in there deliberately because they knew that this was the land of the ancestors, the ancients, and it was an area sacred to them, and that I think that they used to go into anyway, and that they knew about this site. And that anyway, it's quite possible. I think that it's not coincidental that they chose it for that reason at the end, that they went into the land of their the ancestors and hid the remains of their treasure. But in this area, you find megalithic structures, and I looked into who it could be that built them. It certainly wasn't any of the known cultures. I mean, again, the Inca, you have to put this in context. The Inca were in Ecuador and in that area for about 50 years. I mean, they were a Peruvian Andean sort of civilization. Yes, they expanded, into Bolivia and into Ecuador, but they were only there 50 years before the Spanish came. Now, that's not a lot of time. And, they managed to do a few collaborative building projects with, like, the down in parts of Ecuador, you've got Ingapurca, which is Canary Inca, because they kind of are allied with the Canary people and built this structure. But there's not a lot of major Inca structures in Ecuador, so it'd be kind of odd for them to build their largest megalithic structure in an area of inhospitable, inhabitable jungle. For no reason at all, an area they couldn't use, they couldn't really do anything there, and yet you find this giant megalith there. And the people that founded this area, the nearby towns, if you like, Baños de Agua Santa, is the historical record says it's founded by the Lagoa Santa type people, and it says that they came up the river, following the river up from Brazil through the jungles and ended up in this region, right? And they found skulls of Lagoa Santa type people in caves only about 10 miles from the megalithic site back in the beginning of the last century. So, I mean, I know with a pretty good degree of certainty that we are talking about structures related to Lagoa Santa type people. And the Lagoa Santa type people are Australoids because the morphology of their skull shows they are Australoid, and that therefore, and again, they're linked to these sites in Brazil, the oldest sites, 50,000 years ago. And what is particularly interesting here is that the style of the building, right, is large polygonal blocks. The same blocks that you see when you look at the Peruvian, the really old Peruvian sites like Sacsayhuaman, that we have these large multi-faced blocks with like sometimes 6-7 faces that are interlocked, and
interlocked perfectly.
Yeah, interlock perfectly, can't put razor blade between them, have all sorts of weird effects, look like they've been melted in some places, look like they've been molded, all the rest of that. But what you find at this site in Ecuador is that, right? And the key here is that unlike at the other sites, there's no Inca there. This is an inhospitable jungle. It's like in a swamp. Like you have to go through swamps and then into the jungle. And nobody lives in the Yanganatis today. There's no tribes in that area of jungle. It has wildly swinging temperatures, really cold. There's dangerous caves you can fall into. Nobody chooses to live there, put it that way. Obviously, once upon a time, it was very different. But we're going back to when the Amazon jungle was largely savanna. So we're going back way beyond. We're going back at least beyond that 12,000 year gap, to when this great civilization fell. And the interesting thing is that helps to validate another claim, which not only I've made, but certainly others have made, which is that these polygonal block buildings in the Andes are older than the Inca and that they're not Incan. I mean, I think most people now, with a dose of common sense, understands that the argument for these all being Incan is really weak. That, you look at Sacsayhuaman and you look at the lower blocks, these enormous 20-ton, perfectly cut blocks, and you look at the Inca work on the top where they've rebuilt, and they have these, what looks like to me, dry stone walling that I can do. I mean, I've done a bit of dry stone walling, in the past. Yeah, I could do that Inca stone work. You know what I mean? I could bash some stones into those shapes and stack them. That is not really spectacular work. The infill pits, that we see today, you look at it and you can see, Well, that's built by at least 2 different cultures.
Yeah.
You know, in some areas you see 3, and in some of them you can see there's 3 different cultures involved, quite clearly. You know, you've got the oldest work is the best. Then there's some smaller but very similar blocks built on top. You know, again, where there's been repair work, and then you see the last level. The Incas have tried to patch in holes, and their work is really rudimentary. Now, the problem here is that, you know, people have always said, well, the Incas are there, you know, it must be them. But this site in Ecuador, there's no Incas there. There's nobody there. You know, as I say, it's inhospitable, and it has the same stonework. I also found, you know, that there was what I have to call it putty. There was a blue material that when you scraped it away and it got wet because it was raining a bit there, and you rolled it in a ball, it was this ball of blue putty, right? I don't think that we're supposed to have had putty like 12,000 years ago. I'm pretty sure that we're not meant to have had it. And there was like concrete holding the blocks, like some sort of, you know, mortar holding the blocks onto this wall and stuff. So, I mean, but unfortunately, the academics, nobody has gone and hiked in to take a proper look. And so, as usual, it's dismissed out of hand. But
is that the Lost City of the Giants? Is that what you guys are calling the
Lost
City
of the
Giants? Was there anything about giant bones or anything like that there too? Or why is it called that? Just...
The size of some of the artifacts, I mean, there was some very large, what appeared to be like hammer-like artifacts that were found by the Ecuadorian sort of explorers that went in before I went in. They found a number of large, I guess you'd call like pounding stones, these sort of hammerheads that are just so large that, you would assume the people that used them were very tall or very big. I mean, obviously it's not enough evidence to say it really was giants. Yeah. No, but that's why that name came up. It's just because of the size of artifacts. But certainly, the artifacts are of a style unlike any known cultures in the region. They're not Incan artifacts. They're not Panzaleo, which is the other culture in that area. I mean, I've seen Panzaleo tools and I've seen Inca tools and stuff, and there's just no comparison. Where you do see a comparison is I've seen specific artifacts there which are identical to some that have been found in Bosnia at the so-called Bosnian pyramid. I mean, I'm not saying it is a pyramid. I think, obviously there is an archaeological site there and it has artifacts, and they've recovered, and some of what they've recovered there are identical, and also artifacts that are sited in the snowy mountains in Australia. There's a couple of pieces that were found there that are identical to pieces that were found in the site in Ecuador. So, I mean, we're starting to see a correlation again. And particularly interesting there is the correlation between Australia, of course, and Ecuador, because we're seeing, these Lagoa Santa people connected who are Australoids. We're seeing this evidence of this migration 50, 60,000 years ago into Brazil of Australoids. And again, now we're seeing that the polygonal block structures associated with these ancient Australians. So then you're looking and you say, well, hang on a minute, if they built that one, didn't they build the other ones? That surely, if they start doing it in Ecuador in these jungles, that they must also be the builders of the ones on the mountains in the Andes. That when we go down to Peru and stuff, that these older buildings are Australoid, constructions, if you like. These are the remnants of the first global civilization, who I believe were, Australian Aboriginals.
Does that also have to do with the correlation you're talking about with the symbolism between Göbekli Tepe and Easter Island and in South America and Australasia as well?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've identified, and it's becoming out an article in the next couple of months, but I've identified symbols at Göbekli Tepe, which, are exact matches for sacred symbols among a number of indigenous Australian Aboriginal tribes, very distinctly Australian symbolism engraved into some of the key, T blocks there, and also the same symbols have appeared. I found out there at sites, Olmec sites, and also I believe in Bolivia at sites there, and across all the way to Newgrange at the site there, and so we're talking about the remnants of a global culture and the remnants of global knowledge. I'm not saying that necessarily Newgrange is 12,000 years old, but obviously they're getting the hand-me-down, the symbols of this lost civilization, but they go back to the Göbekli Tepe type construction times. We see that they're already in use 12,000 years ago. And 12,000 years ago, there's not a lot of kinds of people anyway. This is another thing we have to sort of get to, because like the Europeans, as we think of today, white, like Caucasoids, as we call them, they don't arise until around 12,000 years ago in terms of like the genetics. So they're finding that even in Southern Europe, the people were distinctly dark-skinned and, black-haired and all the rest of it until around 12,000 years ago. There seems to be an emergence of lighter-skinned people first in the north, which, kind of makes sense because obviously we see like the Norwegians and Icelandics and these people as, these very, I guess, distinctly white like races or... but there's, around about 12,000 years ago. And that before that, in Asia, you've got the first immersion of what they call Proto-Asiatic people around that time, a little bit before then, over between the colonization, somewhere between that colonization event 60,000 years ago, that, we start to get a gradual shift towards Asiatic people in some of the regions up there. But you don't really get Asian people until perhaps 20,000 years ago or something. You start getting Asian people. And then what we think of as modern Europeans are emerging later again. And Black Africans as well, are fairly recent as well, with around that 20,000 years ago or so. That these, I'm not getting the exact dates on them, but, they are, in terms of this, they're quite recent. So in a way, we shouldn't be surprised. And when people say, well, who built Göbekli Tepe? And there's all this, could it be these ones? Could it be these ones? It's like, well, there's actually not a lot of people or a lot of cultures in the world at that time. And as we've already got to, we only know of one culture that goes back 50,000 years in its stories and stuff. And that's the Australian Aboriginals. We don't know of any other culture that existed. That should narrow it down, shouldn't it, really?
What are the ones that come from Nibiru?
Well, you get into all the Anunnaki stuff, and I haven't touched. In my book, I do not mention like Atlantis. I do not mention ancient aliens, but at the same time, I don't discount them in it. I'm not there like saying this is impossible, that's impossible, or it has to be the way I'm saying it. But I'm dealing just with what mainstream scientific evidence.
Yeah, and you're sort of putting it together like they're not doing, right? I mean, you're not even looking at fringe stuff. You're looking at mainstream papers and scientific papers that you're just correlating as well, and it's coming to you're coming to a different conclusion. It's so we've talked about this on the show before, and it blows me away how long it takes the paradigm to shift. Right, the mainstream itself has evidence that points to a different paradigm, yet they just don't acknowledge it yet. And it's in a whole bunch of different areas.
Absolutely, and it's surprising. As I say, I've sat here sometimes. I watch, a YouTube of maybe like leading geneticists involved in this area, and they're presenting their data. I mean, there was one recently with presentation on the first large-scale genetic analysis of Australian Aboriginal DNA. And that revealed a lot of surprises, and the guy is there and he's like, and he looks kind of almost sweating, he's like, and we don't know why that's like that, and it doesn't quite fit, and it looks like he wants to just turn it off and say, I don't want to do this, because he's having to sit there and he can't fit it in, he can't fit it into the models that they're trying to desperately like keep going, and he looks almost like, he's almost like sweating, this is like a top geneticist, and I'm sitting there thinking, I feel like coming and giving you a little hug and whispering in your ear what you should be saying or something, because it's kind of sad, because these guys are, these are the greatest minds on the planet. I mean, make no mistake, I am not saying that I am the new Einstein or Darwin or whatever. I'm not a genius. I have a reasonable intelligence, but I'm looking at these guys and these are our best minds, and they're there like reduced to just like gibbering rubbish to us because they won't just admit, look, hang on, this whole thing doesn't make sense. The emperor's got no clothes. Someone point at him and say, like, he's got no clothes. Let's start again. This is gone completely wrong. We're just propping up a big pile of rubbish. It's got to. I'm sympathetic. I think that it used to be the best model. I'm not going to say it's a big conspiracy. I know people say that it's all conspiracy, and we've been they want us to believe out of Africa for sort of conspiratorial reasons. Maybe there are some people that do, right? Don't get me wrong. I know maybe there's some people that agenda does suit, but I think most of these scientists, they grew up in that paradigm. They've been told that this is the model to work with, that they expect everything to fit into it, and they keep trying to hammer, round pegs into square holes. And when they don't fit in, they kind of drop that information and they focus on what does fit in. Yeah. And that's why we're getting this really sort of shaky version. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you saw this, but for people out there who want to get like a really clear example of where this is nonsense, There's this ongoing persistence that, Australia was first populated 50,000 years ago. That's it. We have, that most of the sites are 50,000 years old or younger, which is true. Most of them are. And they say that, that once they arrived there, basically they burned the boats, nobody else came, it's just them. And for a long time, first of all, I should say that it used to be 20,000 years ago, and then it was 30,000, and then it was 40,000. Now we're up to 50, and some say maybe 60, with evidence that they'd split from other humans by 70,000. So, it keeps going back. But for whatever reason, they keep saying, 50,000. That's when they got there. And then slowly they made their way around the coasts of Australia, which is an enormous continent. Let's not forget, it's bloody big, and they made all their way around the coast until they ended up meeting down in the south, the far south, and then they started to spread inland. And so about 30,000 years ago, you had migrations into the interior, the more inhospitable interior of Australia, and the first sites appeared there. Now that kind of, it makes sense, right, on the face of it. Okay, you say, so you've had 20,000 years, they gradually, these hunter-gatherers migrate, around the coast, then they meet, then they start to move inland. Well, then they found that there were sites that were 49,000 years old in the interior down in the south, right? So it's like, well, now we know what happened was that they arrived and that they split into two groups, they ran super fast, they spread around the coast in 1,000 years, they went into the interior, set up these sites. You're like, hang on a minute.
So they just changed the whole theory to miss.
Yeah, and it's like, you're willing to change that bit, but not the greater context must stay the same. It must still be out of Africa, a 50,000 year inroad, even if you have to throw all of your other work in the rubbish bin. Like, even the common sense of it has to go in the rubbish bin, because otherwise it will undermine that fundamental out of Africa paradigm that you're working in. So the only way now is to say these people ran down, they sailed as fast as they could for no reason into Australia when there's, keep in mind, most of the world is empty, right? So they've raced from Africa 70,000 years ago. Within a couple of thousand years, they've raced all the way along the coasts of Asia for no reason, because they're supposed to be hunter-gatherers that slowly move when they need to get more, food, or when animals that are often, in fact, we see today hunter-gatherers cycle between 3 or 4 pieces of land next to each other, and they just wait for the resources to recover, and they move again, right? Which is really sensible. But no. Well, instead, what they did, they ran into this, terrible climatic event as fast as they could, running down to Southeast Asia. They build the first boats, they sail across, burn the boats, and now they split into two groups for no reason. Remember, they think the first colonization was about 200 people, the first colonization of the whole world. So you got about 200 people. They split into two groups, right? That seems nuts, doesn't it? There's hardly any of you. You've entered apparently a new continent. You don't know anything about it. You don't know what dangers there. Let's split up. You go that way, we'll go this way. And then running as fast as you can, to the south, for no reason, past all these resources. And in the end, you've got to say, someone's got to call bullshit on that and say that just doesn't make any sense at all. It's nonsense. And it's even nonsense compared to what they were telling us 2 years ago or a year ago, which made much more sense. Now it's gone into this thing of, well, we now know that in 1,000 years, they populated the entire coastline of Australia, which is enormous, with just a small group of hunter-gatherers, and they've met in the south, and they've run into the colder interior, into these arid lands for no reason, and they've set up camp. It's like, I'm sorry, but this is rubbish. This is total rubbish. And we know it's rubbish because not only that, there are sites that are older. They found one of the leading geologists, in fact, the guy who discovered Mungo Man, which is the oldest human remains in Australia so far known, which is at least 43,000 years old. Some argue 50, 60,000 years. But even if we take their conservative dating, 43,000 years old near Lake Mungo, they found tools there which seem to be up to 55,000 years old. There's a site up in the north, which they believe also is up to 55 to 60,000 years old. They found shell middens, i.e. where people were cooking and eating shellfish on the east coast of Australia, 75 to 80,000 years old. And this is the same guy that found Mungo Man, who's an out of Africa theorist, also found these shell middens. And he's gone very quiet about this because he doesn't want to be one of the guys that helps undermine the theory he supports, but he identified them as being 80,000 years old. And then 2 separate projects looking at Paleolithic environments, found evidence of mass burning of, forests by humans going back over 100,000 years. They found evidence in core samples in the coral reefs, and they found other evidence, 2 different sites basically showing, like people were doing, fire stick farming over 100,000 years ago. So I don't know, at what point do you just say in it, like, you're wrong. Like, the theory is obviously not supportable, and that it's very clear what's happening. And on top of that, if we go back to the Denisovans, and we know that we interbred with them 44,000 years ago, so they had to be on the continent with us. We can't be isolated here like 50,000 years ago. It just is not supportable. And like they're saying that, well, the breeding must have happened somewhere near Australia, and I say, like, where? Like in the sky above it, under the sea, or like. It's happening on the land, on Australia. There's no other signature of this interbreeding.
International waters.
Yeah, I mean, like, where is that? You say it's somewhere near, because they don't want to say it's in Australia. So it's somewhere near, maybe it's in Southeast Asia, but it's not, isn't it? Because the signature is in Guinea and in Northeast Australia. That's where the people carry the genetics.
Right.
These are the people that have that ancestor. It's happened there. And like, what's more, they found recently, they've realized there's a huge... we call like a genetic division between the peoples of Northeast Australia and Guinea and those to the west and to the southwest. They said, in fact, the difference between them is as great in terms of genetic diversity that, as the difference between I think it's North American, tribes and people in Central Asia, like in Siberia. Vastly different places, way, way apart, big time span between them. But they're seeing the same level of difference between groups spread across like an imaginary line in Northeast Australia and Southwest Australia. But that's nuts, isn't it? That doesn't make any sense. Yeah. And they say this division seems to arise somewhere around 45,000 years ago. Right? Well, hang on a minute. Isn't that when we see this interbreeding with Denisovans? So isn't this division made more? Bear in mind, this was one landmass. Like the sea had not come up yet. We still have one landmass. There's no division between Guinea and Australia. So this is just one land. What would make that division then? Well, perhaps because the people there are considered to be a different species, different race. That's Denisovan territory. We're, these other humans, and we keep separate. But at this point, something happens which changes, and some humans merge with them. But the other lot, they say, well, no, we consider you now like tainted.
Well, isn't that back to Toba then again, possibly?
I think it's to do with, I think that the fact that these Denisovan populations have collapsed to such a small level that prior to that, there is strict rules, if you like, in interbreeding, that the different groups don't want to interbreed. And that's why we see these long periods without interbreeding. But that after this, these populations have collapsed and you start to see perhaps a necessity for interbreeding, and that these populations only survive really by merging with the dominant lineage, which would be, I guess, closer to what we think of as anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens or whatever, that these remnant Denisovans, in the end, whether it's an invasion or what it is, but a group of us, if you know, modern humans, have merged with these Denisovans, probably because of, the after effects of Toba 70,000 years ago, have left this much smaller population, and that now it's been kind of annexed. But these other humans to the southwest look now at these two groups that have merged and say, well, you're all untouchables. We don't consider you having become more human, we consider the humans becoming more Denisovan, and therefore this, although there's this one period interbreeding up there, I think the rest of the continent maintains a very strict interbreeding law. And even the academics have suggested we think that this division must be something to do with taboos with interbreeding, because there's no geological division. There's no other reason we can see why there would be this distinct difference between these two areas. But they don't seem to put two and two together. And that's the thing where I'm just putting two and two together. I can see, well, what would that division be? Well, we know that there's interbreeding 44,000 years ago, and the division is arising around then. Yeah. So, and we know that the Australian Aboriginals have some of the most intense interbreeding laws known on the planet, even today. And the complexity of their interbreeding rules is just mind-bending. I won't even go into it because there's so many subgroups and so many rules that, a snake clan can't merge with with a dingo clan or whatever. And then there's subgroups of that, family groups where you can't marry certain families. And, so we're talking about people that have a recognizable taboo on interbreeding, So you can imagine how strict it would have been about a group which they didn't feel was even of their type, of their people. So they would be like, hey, you lot have broken the taboo, stay up in the northeast and we want nothing to do with you. And so, again, we're seeing more and more of this direct evidence for what's happening.
So what happened to Cro-Magnon man? He was around for a while. Did he get chucked in the trash then because he didn't fit, or?
Well, I think now they're starting to accept that Cro-Magnon really, he's just like an anatomically modern human, that we gave him this name, but really he's just one of these slightly different
Homo sapiens, kind of. Or?
Yeah, the build of his body might have been a bit different. They said a bigger brain, and perhaps he was more stocky than us, but that really, he's just another variance of Homo sapiens, but much closer. I say genetically closer to you and I than, say, a Denisovan, but that he may have had some distinct features, adaptations for Europe and whatnot, and for the cold and stuff. But
right.
No, I think this is being annexed into just archaic humans. So there's a lot there. When you look at all this together, it starts to make a lot of sense. And I don't know if you know, but if you look at some of the finds as well in Australia, particularly in the Willandra Lakes region, which is near Lake Mungo. This is an interior area of dry lake beds, huge dry lakes. So we know that this is an area that once was, essential to life in the interior, because you have huge lakes, like sea-sized lakes almost, where people and animals would have, gone for water. And we find a lot of, hominin remains, or human remains, basically in that area, and tools and whatnot. But one of the strange things that you found in Willandra Lakes region is that some of these the bodies, or the fossils of the humans, are really unusual. They found Mungo man, who looks like a very tall, anatomically modern human. He would be like, he walked down the road in Europe today, you wouldn't know it's Mungo man. He's of the same sort of build as a typical European. He's about 2 meters tall, almost. Yeah, so he's a tall chap, and surprisingly, because obviously in the past we see a lot of small people, but he's very tall. He's 40 something thousand years ago. Gracile. One of the distinguishing features is his skull is about 2 millimeters thick, which is thin by modern standards. We're about 6 millimeters, 7 millimeters on average. So it's a very thin, almost paper thin skull. Nearby, Willandra Lakes 50 hominin, who's younger, about 20,000 years old, I believe. He has a skull about 20 millimeters thick, which is one researcher described as being like having a motorbike helmet, as a skull. Imagine, if he headbutted Mungo Man's head would explode. It's really that vast a difference, and then you've got near to there, you've got another group, which was another one of these lakes, but anyway, not nearby. Anyway, they found some more cow swamp. Sorry, the cow swamp people, and these have the biggest brow ridges known in our species, bigger than Homo erectus. They have elongated skulls, again, very thick skulls. They have what's called archaic traits that make them look more like humans a million years ago than modern humans. And they're only 15,000 years old, right? And so this starts to not really make sense because, up the road, you've got a guy 40,000 years ago who looks like he could walk down any street in Europe and not be noticed. 15,000 years ago, you've got another guy who you would think he was, he was a Homo erectus, something on Neanderthal. So that kind of variation is not seen anywhere else in the world. There's no way you'd see that. It's like you crossing, to the next city from you, and the people look like Neanderthals. You'd say the variation in our area, in our state, is incredible. Look at the people in the next city. You don't see that in Africa. You don't see that anywhere.
So been in Edmonton.
So, that area of huge diversity. We have a few in the southwest of England. I think some inbreeding that leads to strange diversity in the population. But
colonies.
Certainly, it's abnormal. How you look at it is abnormal. I asked one of the leading academics of what we call the multi-regional theory, which is a competing theory against out of Africa. And, I said, well, do you think these could be Denisovans or part Denisovan? He said, well, that is possible, yes, that we might be seeing that these features are Denisovan features and that where, it's been absorbed into the population, that, these people around Willandra Lakes, they may well be carrying remnants. Now that we know that DNA is in the population, perhaps they are what Denisovans would have looked like. We can't be sure, but certainly these are Homo sapiens. I'm going to say that these are not everybody that we have uncovered in Australia, all of the skeletons would be considered members of the Homo sapiens family.
Right.
But the actual, they're not, they're not saying these are Homo erectus, but the look, the morphology is so varied that it shows that we had enormous genetic diversity on that continent, which doesn't make sense if you say that a very small founding population crossed from Asia 50,000 years ago, probably a couple hundred people or something, and that they are the founders of everyone. How can we then see this kind of diversity where even in a small region, you're getting people that are completely different in the way they look, and that, their skull thickness, their brow ridges, it doesn't make sense if you had just a small group of founders. They should look very homogenous, and we should have everyone looking almost the same, and you don't find that. And again, we find that, as I said earlier, the divergence between the north and the southwest, and things that you wouldn't expect with a small founder population isolated, is not adding up.
Huh, that's interesting. So what do you got working on next after, besides the Into America book, which is next, right? What's after that?
Well, I'm most likely going to tackle this. I think the fall and rise of civilization around the turn of the Ice Age with this events 12,000 years ago, which I know we've touched on a little bit here. But yeah, that's when the real sea rise happens, the 100-meter sea rise. It's already underway, but by 12,000 years ago, we get an increased speed of this sea rise, and I believe that at that point we have the fall of a past civilization, obviously, and a rise of another. I mean, of course, that's not a new theory, and I won't be the only person writing about it. I mean, obviously, there's umpteen writers that have written on this theme, and I will overlap with some of them, of course. I mean, I agree with, there's a couple of different books out at the moment, which you probably know. Graham Hancock's got one on, obviously, Magicians of the Gods, which he deals with this, the fall and the comet impact. Robert Schoch has got one, which, he deals a bit with this as well, but he says it's not a comet, it's solar events. I mean, you're probably aware of this. There's a kind of a disagreement there between the two of them.
We just had Randall Carlson on last weekend, and we did a little video one with him where he showed a lot of the climate change from the past, and we talked about the comets and all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah, and his work's great. I mean, I've seen him talking, and I know you guys had him on, and he's really knowledgeable on the subject. And I think that it's, for me, conclusive that there was the comet impact, and I don't have any argument against it. I believe that happened, and not only from the evidence we're finding now, but I'm a bit of a geek, and I've read a lot of ancient texts, and I know that the descriptions of this comet appear across the planet in ancient texts, and I think this is perhaps where Robert Schoch maybe is a bit behind, because there is not only is the evidence support the comet in terms of the physical evidence, the platinum layer, and and obviously there's other geological evidence that's arising, the nanodiamonds. But I look at these traditions, I look at these old texts, and I tell you what, I mean, the descriptions are so ominously the same as what we'd expect now that we understand this event more. I mean, if you look at I'll go into this very briefly, but Graham Hancock explains that there's this cometary body that basically, when it's not heated up directly by the sun, it kind of goes dark. There is this tar-like, petroleum almost like material which heats up to the surface, covers it, hardens, and it goes black. Almost like a tar. And then it, we don't see it. So this huge black body swings around, and then when it heats up, this stuff kind of blows off, and it turns back into a comet. But the thing is, when you I didn't really notice it recently, because when you read some of the ancient texts, and there's a few out there that talk about this, but there's one, for example, the Colbrin book. There's another, which, let me think, it was at let's just say, anyway, there's a number of these ancient texts which describe this thing, the destroyer or the frightener, and it comes in, this roaring beast. And one of the things about it is it drips like oil down onto the land. And they describe this black, tar-like fluid, falling from the skies. And I always thought that just sounds like nuts. Like, what the hell is that? I mean, are they making, is this real? Is this made up, or, exaggerating? But when you understand that this thing is full of this tar-like material, there's no way that these people could have known that, when they've written these texts. Even if you said some of these texts were relatively modern, like hoaxes, because we've only just come to that understanding in very recent years. And these texts, at least some of them go back, some go back certainly thousands of years. Others, you can argue, people say, they're recent, they're, in the last couple of hundred years or something. But, there's no way they would have known this sort of detail. they described this body coming in, this roaring sound, and pieces coming off, and it's causing. In some of the texts, the stars fall from the sky, which obviously we see in the Bible. A third of the stars fell from the sky, which is a pole shift. There's no other way to explain that other than that, seeing an axial pole shift. That this thing is, whatever it is so devastating that it's raining this tar, it's causing fires, it's the sky is roaring with this sound, and that now we're starting to see that these are real world effects of this body, this cometary body, and they probably would be accompanied by other pieces. What they say, that the frightener came in, but it's these other bits were hitting us, but the body itself didn't necessarily hit. But it went so close that it caused, massive destruction, and then other pieces hit us. And I believe that these are accurate. I think there's accurate descriptions of this event, and I think that we were knocked for 6, and that then we began to recover. And this is where I suppose I have a slightly different perspective to both, like
Graham
Hancock and Shock. Yeah, that because I say that yes, and then probably related to the incoming of this event, the sun is destabilized, and that we then see this plasma events, that these are also real, and that it's not an either or, it's both.
Yeah, I was going to say, does Shock just think that it was a solar cycle type thing that ended the ice age, and the comet was just a coincidence? I mean, it just seems too coincidental.
He says that he doesn't find that the comet evidence is compelling, and he doesn't believe there was necessarily a comet. He thinks there might have been a comet, but he doesn't. He basically, he sort of poo-poos it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Doesn't find it compelling. Whereas, and Hancock doesn't talk particularly about the solar event in his book, but I don't think that he's, against it at all.
Yeah, exactly.
But neither of them, have sort of said both. I say it's both. I think the evidence is so compelling for both. I mean, we have the records, not only the geological records, but we have records, from the ancient people showing this. We have, as I say, these ancient texts that talk about the first event. We have the platinum layer. We have all that. So as far as I can say, we know there was a comet, right? And then later on, we have this dip, the cooling that he talks about. Obviously Carlson talks about. We have the sudden cooling that follows. First, there's the sudden melting. The catastrophic floods that wipe North America clean and also destroy, many regions. And then we have sudden cooling. The ice expands again, following the devastation because the dust is thrown up. We have the same kind of effect Toba would have had, this nuclear winter with dust in the air. So we see freezing temperatures. People are hit with that double whammy. But then, there's some remnants of this advanced civilization that has managed, it's global, some remnants have managed to, survive on, and they're doing their best to recover. And then they are hit with an enormous solar storm, which probably this body has gone in towards the sun, or parts of it have gone into the sun. We don't know. But if it's had this devastation on Earth, it's big enough that it could have had some sort of effect on the sun. Especially if part of it went in, and that it's caused a plasma storm, or it may just be blind luck that this has been timed with it, but that within a couple of thousand years, the sun erupts into a wild plasma storm, and we are just bombarded with energy, and we see now on stone carvings across the planet evidence for this. I mean, you're probably aware that they found basically in Neolithic artwork, there's representations of plasma shapes, and there's no way these people, should have been able to know this, but it is international. You find them in the Americas, in Australia, in Europe, particularly there's some sites I think in Bulgaria, showing that these people were witnessing in the sky these plasma phenomenon, and you would have been able to see it all over the planet. In some of these cases, what you would see is a cage surrounding the planet. You'd look up, you'd see bars of energy in the air, like literally surrounding the planet. So from any point you're in, you would have seen that when that was happening. Other shapes as well. There's one that looks like a man with his arms pointing to the sky and his legs out, with the knees bent pointing down. You see that shape, like an H shape almost. And that's a common representation. You may have seen the Indaloo, the man with the rainbow over his head and stuff. But there's these many representations. What looks like a man with his arms, the forearms going up and the legs to the side with the knees bent. But that is actually although it's being given a human form in the artwork, it's a plasma phenomenon. That strange shape is actually is a distinct plasma phenomenon, and we see that one, and with two dots either side of their head, usually two circles. That's a distinct plasma phenomenon, and that's recorded at sites all over the world. So we know that these people were hit again, and I think that's what finished us.
So, and the interesting thing is that there's this great year, and Darren and I and Randall sort of touched on it last week, and maybe there's a galactic cycle going on. And if you look at the Ice Age, the Ice Ages, the cycle, there's a cycle that seems to happen almost every 26 or 30,000 years. And then I don't know if there's a solar cycle that matches that or not, but it's interesting that maybe there's something going on every few thousand years that we enter into a different spot in the solar system or the galaxy, and shit happens, and it's been sort of predicted, and there's myths down through time saying that this is going to happen again.
Absolutely. Yeah, the great year of 26,000, years is encoded into cultures, cultural mythology all across the planet. The importance of that cycle, and that the argument is that every half cycle something seems to get us. I think there's smaller sub-cycles as well. Yeah. I believe that there's a 5,200 year cycle as well, which the Mayans record as well, that we see, because we see a lot going on 5,200 years ago as well. There's the rise of some of our civilizations, and I think that was after a clobbering. Yeah. I think that there are smaller destructive cycles, and we don't necessarily know what all these are.
Half cycle, Jesus.
No, so I think there's the big ones every 13,000 years, but there's a sub-cycle of 5 sets of 5,200 years within that same 26,000 years. So you have two different things going on here, all cyclical. The Mayans particularly point to this because obviously they tell us again and again, time is cyclical. Every 5,200 years is one cycle. Every 26,000 years is another big cycle, but there's always a destruction event risk at the end of these cycles, they tell us. And Hancock talks about that, the Mayan calendar long count seems to correlate with evidence he's found from Göbekli Tepe and stuff, which suggests that they're all telling us that, at the end of that long 26,000, or every 13,000, that we get a risk of being clobbered, and that we're in that window now, And I used to study the Mayan calendar and all that, so I know quite a lot about that. Like many, I suppose, I sort of thought, probably it was kind of accurate to 2012 and all the rest of it. And I guess I made that mistake, but now I understand, from Hancock's perspective, which is I think far more accurate, is that they were pointing at the middle of a window of time. They did their best. They couldn't be 100% like it's going to happen on Wednesday, on this year, because it's too vague. It's a cosmic event. What they could say is, look, you're in that window of 80, he says 80 years, we could say 1 degree of precession, 72 years, that in that degree of precession, that somewhere in it is when the clobbering tends to come, and that we're in that up until the next, say, I think he says the next 20, 30 years. But there's a good chance in the next 20 years that we experience that, and I think that's frighteningly likely. And I haven't got much time, but I think there's something you guys might find interesting. I'll just quickly throw out there, because in terms of the origin of white people and the Europeans, I think there's something to do with this there, because some of these legends talk about, obviously the arks, people went into the arks and all this stuff. And you find this story all around the world that when the great devastation happened and the flood and all the rest of it, people built arks, but also others went under the ground. And we know that there's a lot of underground shelters and stuff, but there's a really old text from the Middle East, which talks about basically the building of what sounds like a modern bunker, like a completely modern bunker, into which the seed of all life is placed, but it's basically, the way it's described is as embryonic life is being taken down into this I think it's a 5-layered construction under the ground, somewhere most likely up in the Caucasus region is where I would place this event, and that they are told, the destruction's coming, and they build this site, and then it has a small population over time, but it doesn't reproduce. The new caretakers come from these seeds. Yeah, so every now and again, a man and a woman's seed are taken and grown, basically from the cryogenic freezer, and so to keep the population going under the ground. And then eventually, the time comes for them to come up, and I believe this is what we call the Aryan invasion of Asia, that these people came up out of, almost like Fallout. If you played Fallout, I think there's something like.
I haven't. No.
I think we got something like that, though. I think these people down in a bunker, and eventually they come back up and they see all the wild, raging tribes of the world or whatever, and they've still got some remnant of this lost civilization, some technology. That these are, if you like, the magicians of the gods. That these people, I believe, they've lost their pigmentation because they've been under the ground for generations. And I know that this is going to be more into the wacky side, which I can't support completely yet, but I think we're going to find more and more evidence that the white race really is from the Caucasus region. The Caucasian race comes out of some hidden sites up in that area, which is not that far from Göbekli Tepe. If you go up towards where Georgian Republic and Armenia, I think that we're talking in that area, and this is where we're finding these really old sites. I think that these. I suspect that there really was advanced survival bunkers, or as advanced as that technology allowed. We don't know. Was it just that they're saying seeds and it's a bit allegorical or something? But I certainly think that they are accurately describing bunkers, that they are going down into bunkers to live in them. And I've been down into sites in Egypt under the pyramids, which are not supposed to exist, but, a friend took me down into some of those. And I'll tell you what, out in the deserts near the pyramids are what looks to me like bunkers. They're these strange concrete-looking structures we went into. And they're not, I've never seen them pictures of anywhere. They're not officially shown to exist, but they look to me like bunkers. And you go down the steps into them. There's square entrances. You drop down to these. They've just got handholds on each side of the walls. You sort of got to push your back against the wall and go down these little grooved handholds. And it goes down into tunnels. And the guy is saying to me, look, the shafts go deeper and deeper. So some of them you can't see to the bottom. You drop burning paper, so you can't see to the bottom if you go down further. And I think that these existed in multiple places. And I believe that, we went down under the ground, both in Egypt and in the Caucasus and in other areas, and people lived it out under the ground. And if they were truly advanced in terms of technology, then maybe they're not just making up the bit about the seeds of life and these, what sound like embryos, but they're possibly what we think of as the white Caucasoids have lost the melanin in their skin from being out of sunlight. Not just in the north and in the snow and in the winter conditions, more like just underground completely. Underground, yeah. Because they were not exposed to that light. And he describes artificial light. He says there's two kinds of light. There's the natural light, like the sun and the moon. It says, and there's the other light that is self-creating. It's like, what is self-creating light? Wow. You're going to use in a bunker. If you're telling me you can go into the ground, but don't worry, there's self-creating light. What's that then? Because I can only think of one thing you could think of in a bunker that you'd call self-creating unnatural light, isn't it? That's like electrical light of some sort, or a technology that allows you to create light underground. Through static electricity or through something. Yeah, you obviously know something, don't you? That, you've come up with a way where you can do that. So there's some really peculiar, texts that are pointing towards a truly advanced civilization, not just the level of the ancient Greeks or Romans or something that was wiped out, but maybe the elements of it had got at least close to where we're at. Maybe if it was like a Victorian level, I don't know if it was space age, but even if you say it was a Victorian level civilization, that it had electricity, it had lights, it had a fairly good understanding of astronomy, it had telescopes. I mean, some of the Mayan knowledge, of the movement of planets is well beyond what you'd really think you can tell from just looking with your eyes. And they had the cycle of Mars within hours wrong, for its annual movement. I mean, that's pretty good. Just looking up at that little dot, with no telescopes. So, I mean, these seem to be hand-me-downs of people that did have telescopes, did have, this kind of level of science, or at least our level 100 years ago or something like that. They're kind of close to us, Yeah, that kind of makes sense, because there's not really a really good theory about that, I don't think, otherwise, right, of where the white people came from. Really. Besides aliens and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, and I don't think we need the aliens again, Hancock says. Look, I don't dismiss it further back in time. I mean, I don't go into it in this work, but I have written about it, but I see that if there was an influence from them, that it goes back much further, back to closer to 1 million years ago. That's where I find the evidence. If anything is in that period, 800,000 years ago, that possibly then, when we see this sudden emergence of all these different hominins and the sudden leap forward in the brain and the sudden change, if if there was involvement in some sort of, that kind of way, or if it was an advanced human civilization doing genetic engineering or whatever, I see that happening 800,000 years ago, if anywhere. I don't really see the evidence when people talk about the Anunnaki doing this 200,000 years ago or 400,000 years ago or in recent time. I don't think there's a compelling evidence. I think the rest of this story is definitely a human story. Yeah. If there was any alien involvement, I only see it that far back. I don't see we need to put it in the recent times at all. It looks like, we build out of stone. We're not using, we don't see advanced nanofiber, nanocarbon tubule built domes or something where you'd say, well, look, this looks alien technology or something. We see big stones being moved around, right? Which to me, I don't think you fly to another planet and you start cutting big stones and, you're going to have something better, aren't you? You've got there on a spaceship that can travel at light speed or something. You say, now let's start hewing the stone and, it doesn't make sense. You just shoot down nanobots and they build you a dome or something. I just don't believe you can mix space age technology with stone age technology.
Yeah. Yet they might have had electricity in Egypt. We had this guy on really good theories about a lot of the hieroglyphs showing that they're using static electricity and accumulating it and even having, batteries and lights and stuff like that. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they certainly probably did. And I think that if we go back far enough that there was electricity, how it was generated, maybe it's different. I can't talk for much longer. I'll just say that on 3 o'clock I have to go. But I will say that if you look at, say, the Great Pyramid, we know that once upon a time it was clad in white mica, and it's actually an 8-sided structure, and that is concaved, and it looks like it's some sort of refractor, of energy, of light. And I do wonder if it wasn't in some way harvesting energy, maybe once upon a time there were structures like that they used to harvest sunlight. Now we do that today, don't we? We have solar panels. Maybe it was something like that, or it was refracting that light to somewhere else where it was harvested. Yeah. And I think that maybe even if it wasn't doing that, maybe it's a copy of something that did do that. Because why is it 8-sided? Why is it a refractor? Why have they made it like that? Why was it clad in white mica, which would have reflected sunlight and all the rest of it? So there's some strange things there, as if they're echoing back to a knowledge when that was useful, when refracting energy and light was useful. So perhaps we did gather sunlight in the past in some way, and it wasn't necessary, and is Tesla and people said maybe we had wireless electricity, maybe we won't ever see the wires and the generators and things that we expect because maybe they didn't go down our path, they went down another path. Exactly. But they still got electrical energy. So I think you'll see my work probably going down that route. I'm going to be tackling the fall and rise of that civilization and linking it to the Australian Aboriginals and their culture, the ongoing culture.
That sounds great. I mean, we're looking forward to reading that. And I mean, it'd be nice if you get your books on audio too eventually. I like to definitely think that's popular with our listeners, the audio format. But maybe you should come back on when that comes out. We can hit this stuff again. It's been a great chat.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, no worries. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. And, I think we covered a lot there. So hopefully your listeners like it. And, be glad to come back. I better go because, my wife's got to do some work, thanks. So I'm afraid I have to run.
Right on. Yeah, it was great to really visualize. It really helped me go through that whole timeline and visualize everything. And it did. It was a great chat. So thanks for spending so much time here.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay take care, guys.
Bye, Bruce.
Cheers. Ciao. Bye-bye.